For the next 3 hours, we look at the strangest and most dangerous side of Star Wars. The galaxy runs on 25,000 years of history, and most of it follows rules that make sense. What comes next does not. These are the corners even the Jedi and the Sith could not control, the things both orders feared, buried, or agreed never to touch. Some were hidden on purpose, others should never have existed at all. It begins with the powers both sides agreed no one should ever use. The Opera House is dim. On a stage suspended in water, the performers drift through the low lights, colors shifting behind them. In a private box above the crowd, two figures sit close. One is the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, the other is a young Jedi who has not slept well in weeks because he keeps dreaming of a woman's death. Palpatine waits for the right moment in the performance. Then, quietly, he begins to tell a story about a Sith Lord so powerful and wise, he learned to use the Force to keep the people he cared about from dying. The Jedi turns to look at him, and the trap closes. The story Palpatine told that night was true. His own master, Darth Plagueis, had spent decades on one obsession with two faces. He wanted to live forever, and he wanted to keep others from dying when it suited him to keep them alive. Sith Lords across 20,000 years had wanted power, longevity, revenge, and empire. Plagueis wanted something stronger. Other Sith before him had pursued essence transfer or bound themselves to holocrons. Some had become Sith spirits, lingering in the world after death. Those were all ways of extending one's own life. But Plagueis was after the rule itself. He wanted to understand why living things died at all, find the mechanism that allowed it, and break that mechanism. That is why he fixated on midichlorians more directly than any Sith before him. Every living cell contains microscopic organisms called midichlorians. They are the bridge between biology and the Force, and the higher the count, the stronger the Force sensitivity. Sith alchemists for centuries had worked on biology, reshaped species, twisted creatures, built new life from old, but they worked on life as it already existed. Plagueis was reaching further down. He treated midichlorians as the place where the Force and the body actually meet, the mechanism through which a living being is kept alive at all, and he tried to influence that mechanism directly. If death were a failure of that mechanism, then death was not a law of nature, it was a defect. The Luceno novel describes specific experiments. Plagueis kept living creatures in a private laboratory, sustaining them past every natural limit. He worked with the Yanchori, a Force-resistant species he tried to break by force-feeding them experiences in the Force itself. He spent decades studying what happened when a midichlorian count was pushed up or pulled down by direct interference. The work was meticulous, patient, and it spanned most of his adult life. He was not improvising. He was building, slowly, towards a larger result, and for a while, he was right. In James Luceno's Darth Plagueis novel, the Sith Lord could sustain life past the point where it should have ended. He could influence midichlorian behavior in ways that contradicted everything both the Jedi and the Sith had built their traditions around. By the internal logic of what he was attempting, the research was succeeding. Then, the Force answered. The novel implies that the birth of Anakin Skywalker was not a coincidence. A child born without a father, carrying the highest midichlorian count in galactic history, appeared at precisely the moment Plagueis' interference was going deepest. The Force, pushed hard enough at its biological foundation, generated a being who could restore the balance that interference had disturbed. That response was a child who would, within a generation, personally end the Sith Order that Plagueis' own apprentice spent his entire life building. Plagueis had not just failed to conquer death, he had handed the Force exactly what it needed to end the Sith. Palpatine planted one more detail in that opera box, the one he framed as the only mistake Plagueis ever made. The Sith Lord, who came closer than anyone to defeating death, did not die in a duel or in old age. He was killed in his sleep by his own apprentice after teaching that apprentice everything he knew. Plagueis, the most knowledgeable Sith of his era on the question of life and death, could not see his own death coming from the person closest to him. Even Sith tradition had reasons to leave this kind of work alone. Nobles on the planet Bajoon had conducted forbidden experiments on midichlorians in an attempt to increase Force sensitivity, and the entire planet's population had gone mad and slaughtered each other. Darth Dreer, an earlier Sith Lord, had pursued immortality as well, though through ritualistic methods rather than Plagueis' midichlorian experiments, and died in the attempt. Plagueis kept his own research hidden because the techniques were considered too unstable for any but the most powerful Sith to attempt. No documented Sith ban on this practice survives in the records. They had a record of the people who had tried this and what had happened to them, and most Sith chose to leave it there. Midichlorian manipulation never spread further. The Jedi understood the Force as a relationship rather than a system to be engineered, met through meditation and detachment rather than domination. That worldview did not require knowing what Plagueis was doing in order to reject the path he was on. The Jedi position on death was the philosophical opposite of Plagueis's. Where he treated death as a defect to be fixed, the Jedi thought that there is no death, only the Force. A Jedi who died returned to the energy field that had given them life. Healing was permitted. Binding the dying back to the world was not. The Jedi who learned to keep their consciousness after death, beginning with Qui-Gon Jinn and continuing through Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, did so through release into the Force, not control over it. Plagueis was trying to conquer the rule. The Jedi were trying to live with it. Long before Plagueis, a planet died in silence. There was no battle above Qatar, no fleet, no siege. One figure arrived, and by the time he left, every living thing on the surface was gone. They were not killed by weapons, they were drained, pulled out of existence by something that had once been a man and no longer was. His name was Darth Nihilus, and the technique he used is called Force Drain. Force Drain is a combat ability. A practitioner pulls Force energy, or life energy, away from another being and absorbs it. It weakens the enemy and strengthens the user. Sith across thousands of years used it this way, a weapon, a battlefield advantage, used on individuals at the human scale. In a duel, it had natural limits. The user drained an opponent, won the fight, and stopped. Nihilus is where those limits broke. At the end of the Mandalorian Wars, a weapon called the Mass Shadow Generator activated above the planet Malachor 5. The device used gravitational force to crush everything in range. The Mandalorian fleet, the Republic ships, and every Force-sensitive being on the surface and in orbit were caught inside it simultaneously. Thousands died in the space of a moment, and every one of those deaths sent a wave through the Force. 2 people survived that wave. What had made each of them was not the same thing. The first was a Jedi general who had given the order to activate the weapon. The Council's records describe what she carried afterwards as a wound in the Force. She had cut herself off instinctively, the way a body goes into shock, because the alternative was to feel all of it. She returned to the order severed from the Force, not through punishment or ritual, but through what the event had done to her at the level where a living being connects to it. She did not drain others deliberately. She formed bonds through the Force, the way all Jedi did, but those bonds now pull life and will from the people around her without intending it. The wound transmitted itself outward. The Council's response was exile. Not healing, not studying, not an attempt to understand how a wound of that kind formed or how it might be closed. They sent her away because what she represented was something the Order had no language to address. The second survivor had been inside the field too. He did not develop Force Drain gradually. Something in him was rewritten at the instant Malachor broke, and what came out was no longer entirely a man. His name was Darth Nihilus. Same event, same field. One came out as an involuntary wound that gave without meaning. The other came out as a hunger that could not stop taking. Qatar was not a random target. A hidden conclave of surviving Jedi had gathered there, believing the location was secret, and that gathering called to Nihilus like a beacon. Qatar was also home to the Miraluka, a species that does not see with eyes. The Miraluka sense the world entirely through the Force. It is not a tool they use, it is the medium through which they sense color, texture, direction, distance, and each other. The Jedi Conclave and the Miraluka population together made Qatar unusually loud in Force terms, to something like Nihilus. When he arrived, there was no fight. He drained the planet, and one person remained. Her name was Visas Mar, and she was Miraluka. She had not been spared, she had been left behind, the only thing remaining on Qatar. What she carried after Qatar was the experience of feeling every other living thing on her planet stop existing, registered through the only sense she had. Nihilus did not let her go. A force bond formed between them, and the moment he drained her world, hell closed by his will afterward. Visas served him for years, not as a willing apprentice, but as a tethered survivor, kept alive because he could draw on her connection to him whenever he needed to. She was his eyes in the galaxy, sent to find new sources of life he could feed on. The bond was eventually broken when she met the same Jedi who had survived Malachor, who could sense the leash and help her pull against it. Visas turned on Nihilus directly, but for the years between Qatar and that turning, she was the proof of what Force drain leaves behind. Not corpses, but witnesses, kept alive on the strength of someone else's hunger. His body had withered. His identity had collapsed. What walked in that armor was no longer a man using technique, it was hunger wearing the last outline of the man he used to be. Nihilus believed he was consuming the Force, but the Force was consuming him through the hunger he had invited in, and by the end, there was no room left in him for anything else to live. Nihilus had been a problem within the Sith long before he reached Qatar. His own master, Darth Traya, perceived his hunger for the Force as detrimental to the Sith's goals, not a useful weapon, but a parasite that would eventually collapse under the weight of what it consumed. Sith tradition treated Force drain as a tool. What Nihilus had become was outside that tradition, dangerous to other Sith as much as to the galaxy. Even within the Sith, the technique had a recognized limit. Nihilus had crossed it before he ever arrived at Qatar. Other Sith looked at what the dead still held and saw a different kind of hunger, not consumption, but inheritance. Force walking was an ancient Sith practice. The user traveled to places heavy with the dead and bound Sith spirits to his own mind so he could absorb their knowledge. As a shortcut, it was brilliant. Inside Sith logic, it was almost rational. The dead could not spend their knowledge, and Sith practice did not see why it should decay with them. A Sith Lord known to history as Darth Nox, active during the era covered in the Old Republic, a legend source, did not bind one spirit. He bound 4, and nothing in the practice required it. Binding one ghost for its knowledge is a tool. Binding 4 is something else. Nox came to Force walking as a last resort. He was being hunted by Darth Thanaton, a far more powerful enemy, and the practice was the path forward. He consumed the spirit of Darth Andru first, then bound additional Sith apparitions, until enough power was gathered to challenge Thanaton directly. Each ghost carried an error with him. Ergas had taught the Force Walk ritual to the very student who, in death, bound him with it. Darth Andru's tomb had killed the previous Sith sent into it before Nox arrived. Horak Mul was an ancient Sith of enough significance that his ghost still held real power thousands of years after his death. Kalatos Zavros had been a member of the Dark Council in his own era, powerful enough that even his remnant carried weight. 4 ancient Dark Lords pulled into the same living mind, each carrying the grudges and ambitions of a different century. It worked. With those bound spirits, Nox defeated Thanaton, took his seat on the Dark Council, and was given the title that history would remember. But the spirits did not stay quiet. Nox is alone in his chambers, considering a decision. He reaches for his own judgment and finds something else reaching at the same time. A preference that is not his, an instinct for pursuit that belongs to a different century. Horak Mul, centuries dead, had been a figure of weight in his own era, and the instincts of someone who had held that much influence do not come into his mind quietly. Nox feels Horak Mul's ambition is moving behind his own. He sets the thought aside, but it comes back, and he acts on it. He does not entirely remember deciding to. The pressure built from there. The spirits had patience, and Nox had only so much room inside one mind. Choices that should have taken seconds began taking longer because 4 other voices were trying to weigh in. Decisions Nox thought were his own arrived with someone else's reasoning attached. The practice had promised him knowledge on demand. What it delivered was a council, and the Council did not always vote this way. After the second confrontation with Thanaton's faction, the bound spirits became uncontainable. They tore through Nox's body and mind. The result was a crippling sickness, severe enough to threaten his life, and Nox was forced to spend serious effort tracking down a cure. Only after that intervention could the spirits be subdued and forced back into something he could hold. From the outside, he looked powerful, but inside, it was a siege. He had reached for the dead, and the dead had nearly taken him with them. Within the Sith Order, Force walking was not a sanctioned practice. Darth Thanaton, the Dark Council member Nox eventually overthrew, was a strict traditionalist who treated the ritual as a violation of Sith doctrine any orthodox Sith would refuse. Nox had pursued it specifically because it was outside the rules. Even the Sith, who had developed the ritual centuries earlier, had come to treat it as something only the desperate or the doomed would attempt. A power available to anyone willing to risk being eaten by it, but recognized within the Order as a path the discipline did not endorse. The Jedi had encountered the same edge from the other side, and the cost was on record. Generations of Jedi who chose to commune with Sith spirits or pull knowledge directly from the dead had ended the same way that Nox almost did. Freedun Nad had been a Jedi prodigy from Ossus before he sought out the long-dead Sith Lord Naga Sato and became a Dark Lord whose own spirit corrupted others for centuries after his death. Exar Kun followed the same shape. A Jedi student who broke into Sith holocrons on the Jedi world of Dantooine, then learned directly from the spirits of Mark Aragnos and Freedun Nad, then turned on his teachers and waged a war that nearly ended the Order. Ulic Qel-Droma fell with Kun. The Jedi response was not a doctrine paper, it was the names of those who had reached for the knowledge of the dead and not come back. And afterward, the Jedi formally regarded the path as forbidden within their teachings. Two traditions in open war for 1,000 years had each walked to the same edge and stepped back from it. Not together, not by agreement. The edges simply lined up, and neither side knew the other had found them. But the result was the same as the agreement. The same three techniques, the same two traditions. The same conclusion was reached on each. This path is not one to walk. The Force is capable of answering back. It notices, it responds, it corrects, and every practitioner who ever thought he was the one in control was only holding the technique until it decided to let him go. Those techniques were powers too unstable to keep, and both orders walked away from them. But a power does not have to be practiced to stay dangerous. Sometimes, it gets sealed inside an object that carries the same hunger with no living hand to guide it. The Jedi and the Sith tried to destroy these objects, and almost every attempt failed. A Dark Lord of the Galactic Empire cut open an ancient coffin on a desert moon. He had come looking for a weapon to use against his master. What stepped out was a woman who had been sealed inside it for nearly 4,000 years. Her name was Celeste Morn. Vader's clone troopers moved to secure her, and within seconds, they were no longer men. Their skin hardened into plates under the armor, and their fingers lengthened into claws. One man's jaw split open around new teeth, and he lunged at the man beside him. The squad became rock ghouls, Sith-spawned mutants, and turned on everything within reach. Caught between his transformed troopers and the Jedi he had just disarmed, Vader retreated. Vader was a Dark Lord of the Sith, carrying out a Sith errand. The artifact he came for had been built by Sith founders, used by Sith lords, and hunted by every dark side power that had ever known of it. Vader walked away from it. Almost no other Sith Lord in the long history of the Order ever did. Whatever had stopped him was around Morn's neck, and the metal had a name, the Mor Talisman. It held the spirit of a dead Sith Lord called Karnes Mor, and it carried a plague that could warp almost any nearby non-force sensitive sentient into a Rakghoul. Morn had carried it for nearly 40 centuries. In the Legends timeline, an artifact dangerous enough to make a Dark Lord of the Sith retreat was rare, but it was not the only one. Across thousands of years of Sith and Jedi history, only two artifacts stand out as things both sides, working independently and centuries apart, tried to erase completely. Thousands of years earlier, a different weapon had pushed a different Sith Lord to a far more extreme response than retreat. His name was Darth Revan, and and the artifact he wanted to destroy was called the Dark Staff. The Sith who made the Dark Staff many millennia earlier tried to destroy it before Revan was ever born. An unnamed Dark Lord, recorded in later archives only as the artifact's maker, finished creating the staff, looked at what he had made, and came to regret his creation. The staff killed him. The staff drained Force essence from living beings, possessed the minds of those who held it, animated corpses into dark side using zombies, and twisted living creatures into Sith spawn. Anyone near it felt an uncomfortable pressure on their concentration. After the creator's death, the artifact drifted through the galaxy for ages. At one point, the reconstituted Sith Empire acquired it and carried it to a relic storage station called the Arcanum. The staff was sealed inside a reliquary in the specimen storage wing, with a plaque bolted to the case warning that the artifact must not be touched or interacted with physically or mentally. The vault's plaque was the Sith Empire's own admission that they had built something they cannot safely use. A Sith Lord named Togris, working for a group of renegade Sith called the Dreadmasters, penetrated the Arcanum storage wing and pulled the Dark Staff out of its reliquary. The Dreadmasters were 6 powerful Sith Lords who had served the Sith Emperor for ages before breaking from the Empire. Togris used the staff to interrupt the Sith holocron that was holding a Deshad assassin in stasis nearby. The Deshad slowed his pursuers, while Togris escaped the Arcanum with the Dark Staff. Strike forces from both the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic pursued Togris. He took the staff to a Dreadguard sanctum on Belsavis and left it with his apprentice, who tried to wield the artifact and was drained dry midway through the battle. The staff vanished from the sanctum in a fiery explosion. Eventually, it ended up on a planet called Oblis in the Kuleran system. The Obli, a species that lived on the planet, began studying the staff. Working through their minds, the staff summoned a shadow creature into the atmosphere of their world and fed them the fear that the creature had come to destroy them. The Obli built a machine to expel the creature and used the Dark Staff as its power source. The staff absorbed the power the Obli channeled into it and used it to destroy Oblis. What survived of the Obli home world settled into a ring of debris around the nearest star. The Kuleran asteroid belt is still drifting in orbit where Oblis used to be. The Obli were not Sith. The staff destroyed them on the same terms it had destroyed every Sith who had ever touched it. Whoever picked it up was the next casualty, regardless of which side of the Force they served. Years after the world broke apart, a Sith Lord came to the asteroid belt drawn by the staff itself. His name was Darth Revan. Revan was a Zelosian, a plant-based humanoid species that mimicked human appearance closely enough to pass. He took the name Darth Revan from a corrupted Sith manuscript that had garbled the name of Darth Revan, the Dark Lord of the Sith redeemed during the Jedi Civil War, long before Revan's own era. He carried the misreading as his own title for the rest of his life. He found the Kuleran system during the New Sith Wars, a 1,000-year conflict between the New Sith Empire and the Jedi-led Republic. He settled on a poisonous world in the system called Almas. The atmosphere was not breathable, and the soil was hostile, so Revan terraformed it. Using Sith alchemy and biological manipulation, he engineered a species of grass called Callothin, seeded it across the surface, and rewrote the atmosphere through the grass until he could walk outside without a mask. Then, he built a fortress. Revan designed the fortress as a focal point for the dark side. He constructed a dome that channeled dark side energy. The floor of the lightsaber training chamber and his most valuable bookcases were lined with Mandalorian iron, resistant to the Force and to lightsaber blades. The walls held mechanical traps invisible to Force senses and to technology, and the dungeon cell severed a Force user's connection to the Force entirely. He wrote his autobiography in the Sith language directly into the inner walls. But the whole construction, the grass, the stone, the trap corridors, was scaffolding around a single obsession. The Dark Staff was hidden inside an asteroid in that same belt. Revan began trying to reach it. The staff communicated in its own way. It entered Revan's dreams, and the Sith Lord wrote down what the staff told him. His journals were recovered from the fortress by Jedi investigators centuries later. Some of those investigators worked for a body inside the Order that the Council itself did not know existed. They delivered the journals to the Jedi Council anyway. The Council took the warning seriously enough that the Order maintained a watch over the Almas fortress for the next 1,000 years. Revan described the Dark Staff as an emptiness, a slice of the universe where there was no light and no heat, but also no cold and no dark. Light, he wrote, moved around it without entering its grasp. The staff did not want the light. It wanted the Force. Revan wrote that the staff hungered for energy and destruction. It possessed the desire to end lives. Its immense hunger was what disturbed him the most, and it was the reason he both feared the staff and sought to destroy it. He would build a mechanism to destroy the staff instead. During those long years, Revan built an army. Using Sith alchemy and rituals he developed inside the fortress, he created a new kind of Sith soldier called a Battle Lord, force bonded to the commander they served. If a Battle Lord ever tried to harm Revan, the wound turned back on the soldier. He took an apprentice around the same time, a man named Darson, who would come close to attaining Dark Lord rank under the planned Sith name Darth Malus. The two trained together inside the fortress for years. Revan's alchemical experiments killed Darson before he could complete his rise, and rather than let the body be wasted, Revan bound his apprentice's spirit to the fortress as a guardian. The Jedi eventually located Almaz and attacked the fortress directly. The terraformed grass burned across the surface as starfighters bombarded the trapped corridors, and the outer fortress structures collapsed under the assault. The inner tower held. The Battle of Almaz was the last scene of Revan's life, and he knew, going into it, that the artifact had to be destroyed at that moment. If he died first, the staff would certainly be able to find a new hand with which to continue hatching its plans. Revan got hold of the Dark Staff during the battle. He tried to use its power against the Jedi attacking his fortress. The staff drained him instead, exactly as he had written it would. The same emptiness that had refused the light pulled him into itself. The energy it pulled out of him opened a force storm, a hyperspace wormhole unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Revan lost control the instant it formed. The staff used him as its battery, tearing through his army on its way out. Every Battle Lord Revan had bonded to his command was consumed inside the storm, and the Sith Lord was thrown forward through time. Revan came out of the storm centuries later on a world called Ruusan during the final campaign of the same war he had been fighting. The new Sith Wars had raged for centuries after he vanished from Almaz. The Army of Light, led by the Jedi Lord Hoth, was locked in a series of brutal battles against the Brotherhood of Darkness, a Sith confederation led by Lord Khan. Revan walked onto that battlefield without warning to the soldiers on either side. The Dark Staff had stripped him of his connection to the Force during the storm. He was simply there, on the field, unable to use the Force, and without any idea where he was. He was killed by a Force user of no particular note. Meanwhile, the crypt Revan had built for himself inside the Almaz fortress stayed empty. Back on Almaz, it looked as if he had fled the battle and been killed by his own apprentice Darson. But Darson had been dead for some time by then. The fortress outlasted Revan, the whole Killeran system did, almost forgotten by the wider galaxy, with the Dark Staff sitting inside an asteroid for nearly 1,000 years before anyone knowingly went looking for it. Around 31 BBY, shortly after the invasion of Naboo, a Force-sensitive criminal named Len Marcus went into the Killeran asteroid belt to find the Dark Staff. He did not go on his own initiative. Marcus was one of the chief lieutenants in the organization of a Killeran crime lord named Narama, acting as a representative of its smugglers, and Narama had sent him into the asteroid belt. Marcus had his own reasons for going. He had heard about the Dark Staff, he wanted it for himself, and the job Narama had given him was cover for the search. Marcus found the staff inside an asteroid designated I-9 and recovered it. With the artifact on board, he turned his ship towards open space and began the flight out of the system. On the way out, the ship passed the planet Almaz. The fortress on Almaz had been sitting empty for nearly 1,000 years. The Jedi who drove Revan from the planet had not destroyed the inner tower. Its defenses had gone dormant, with no one to maintain them. But the fortress remembered what it had been built for, and when Marcus's ship passed overhead with the staff on board, something inside the stone recognized what was there. The dome fired a bolt of force lightning at the Dark Staff. The bolt struck the staff. The collision between Revan's weapon and his defense created a time vortex, and the entire Killeran system vanished from the galaxy. It reappeared 10 years later during the Clone Wars. No one inside the system had experienced the passage of time. Marcus was still on his ship with the damaged staff, Narama's organization was still running the asteroid belt, and the planets were all where they had been. The galaxy had moved on 10 years without them. The staff had been damaged in the strike, and Marcus could not use it for years. Around the start of the Clone Wars, Marcus made a deal with a Shevan slaver named Phyllis Mon. Marcus gave Mon the Dark Staff and access to the Almaz fortress. In exchange, Mon would use the rituals Revan had left behind in the fortress to extract Force essences from captured living beings and feed them to the staff so the staff could rebuild. They built an extraction pyramid on Mon's ship, the Enemy Asma, and began trapping Force essences inside it. but the staff had already drawn attention to something it had not planned for. A team of freelance agents called the Heroes of Kil'aren, who had been tracking darkside activity across the system, boarded the enemy Asma together with a Jedi named Odin Malksh. The Dark Staff sensed them coming. It reached into the nearest body it could find, a slave of Phyllis Mons named Alianda, and possessed her. Speaking through her mouth, the staff offered the boarders anything they wanted if they turned back, and promised to destroy them if they did not. The boarders refused. The Dark Staff withdrew from Alianda and abandoned the ship, but it left the crystal pyramid running so it could keep absorbing the Force essences trapped inside. The boarders destroyed the pyramid before the staff could finish repairing itself. Then, they went after the staff. The Dark Staff planned to consume a Jedi-crafted artifact called the Eye of the Sun, hidden inside a Chihala tree on the planet Kil'aren, and used the absorbed Jedi energy to destroy the entire star system. Marcus carried the staff to the tree, and the Heroes of Kil'aren arrived before it could reach the eye. A Force user among them channeled the light side of the Force directly into the Dark Staff. Under the pressure of pure light, the Dark Staff came apart. On the other hand, the Moor Talisman had been waiting longer than the Dark Staff's entire existence. Thousands of years earlier, when the Sith Order itself was still being founded, a Jedi exile named Karnes Moor was building an army out of living flesh. Thousands of years before Darth Revan was born, before even the Great Hyperspace War between the Old Sith Empire and the Republic, a group of renegade Jedi were exiled from the galaxy after losing a conflict called the 100-Year Darkness. They had practiced a forbidden form of darkside alchemy, twisting living flesh into war creatures. The Jedi Order defeated them at the Battle of Korbas and banished the survivors into the unknown regions. One of those exiles was a former Jedi Knight named Karnes Moor. He and his fellow exiles had studied the dark side deeply enough to master it. They traveled across uncharted space, crashed on a world called Korriban, and encountered the red-skinned native species who call themselves the Sith. They enslaved the population, claimed the planet, and took the local name for their order. Moore, one of the founders, specialized in flesh. Using the same alchemy the exiles had been banished for practicing, Moore began engineering creatures from living stock. His most successful creation was a species he called the Rakghoul, a bipedal predator with hard and plated skin, clawed hands, a distended jaw, and no mind of its own beyond what a Force user commanding the creature chose to give it. Moore designed the Rakghoul as a disposable soldier. Moore planned to raise an army of Rakghouls and use that army to conquer the galaxy, but the flesh was only half of the weapon. A fellow exile, the alchemist Sorza Sin, built Moore the first of 3 objects she called the Great Amulets. The talisman was a small piece of dark Sith metal designed to hold part of Moor's essence after his body died, and to spread his Rakghoul transformation to anyone nearby who was not Force sensitive. The metal carried a plague. Anyone without a Force connection who came near it in a wielder's hands risked turning into a Rakghoul instantly, without requiring any injuries. At the same time, Moore had engineered a slower, virus-like form that could spread through a Rakghoul's bite or claw. Once the artifact had seeded a single infected host into a population, the contagion kept moving on its own. Moore made the plague to spread without him, and the talisman to outlive him. The whole design assumed his body would die before his work was finished. The death of his future host was built into the plan from the start. Any Force user who touched the amulet faced the same kind of intrusion. But where the Dark Staff had ambitions its host could still resist, Moore's fragments spoke directly into decisions, and given enough time, replaced the wearer entirely. Stronger Force users were better vessels, and the old Sith Lord worked harder on them. The medallion also stopped the wearer from aging. It became one of the most hunted artifacts in Sith history. Nagasato, who would later lead the old Sith Empire against the Republic, spent years trying to locate it. Other Dark Lords tore at each other trying to claim it, and none of them found it. The artifact behaved almost as if the Force did not want it found. Centuries after Moore's death, the last Sith-bearer was killed in a cave-in inside the Undercity of Taris. Taris was a planet-wide city world with a glittering surface and buried lower levels where the poor lived without sunlight. Moore's talisman fell with its dying owner into the Undercity and stayed there. For hundreds of years, it sat in the Taris lower levels, slowly seeding the Rakghoul plague into the outcast population that lived in those tunnels. The city did not notice. The lower levels became a quarantine zone where infected creatures prowl the dark. The plague spread generation after generation, and the surface government responded by building walls and shooting anything that came up. The wait ended in 3963 BBY when a Mandalorian scientist went looking for the talisman on purpose. His name was Pulsifar. He was a Mandalorian scientist dismissed by other Mandalorians as not a real warrior. He pitched the Taurus excavation himself over Cassius Fett's skepticism and got approval to lead it. This was the early years of the Mandalorian Wars, the galactic-scale invasion of Republic space that would eventually draw Revan and Malak out of the Jedi Order. Pulsifar believed the Force was a myth and that what Jedi call Force abilities actually came from magical possessions. The Mor Talisman, in his theory, was the key to unlocking what the Jedi had been hiding. He took a survey team to Taurus after the Mandalorians captured the planet and descended into the Undercity. They dug through the rock ghoul-infested tunnels. They reached the chamber where the artifact had been buried for hundreds of years, and they pulled it out of the ground. The necklace had spent centuries waiting for a Force user. Pulsifar was not one, but it latched onto him aboard the Maresi before the ship reached the staging world of Jebel. When one of Pulsifar's men tried to pry it off, Pulsifar touched the man's chest plate and left glowing red marks on the armor where his fingers had landed. The man died on the spot and later transformed into a rock ghoul. Having found Pulsifar unworthy, the talisman waited for someone stronger. Pulsifar had killed one of his own men to keep the artifact. Within hours of recognizing he was the wrong man, the artifact killed him in turn. The talisman had let him think he was claiming it, but in reality, the sentient artifact picked its own wearers and discarded the ones who didn't fit. On the other side of the galaxy, the same hidden body that had recovered Revan's journals had already seen what was coming. The group called itself the Jedi Covenant. Its members had their identity scrubbed from official records, answered to no council, and existed to identify Sith threats early and stop them before another great Sith war. Seers within the Jedi Covenant saw a vision of widespread destruction involving the Mor Talisman and 4 individuals. One was a fugitive Padawan named Zane Carrick. The other 3, unknown to the Covenant, would later become Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, and Cade Skywalker. They decided to find the medallion first. One of their operatives was Celeste Morn, a Covenant shadow whose job was locating darkside artifacts and containing them before anyone else found them. The Covenant sent her after the necklace and also ordered her to bring in Zane Carrick, whom the Covenant had framed for the Padawan massacre of Taurus. But by the time Morn got close to the talisman, Pulsifar had already recovered it. Morn followed Pulsifar's team out of the Undercity and stowed away on the Maresi for the trip to Jebel, the ice world the Mandalorians use as a staging ground. Zane Carrick was also on board, along with his friend Marn Hieroglyph. None of the 3 knew the others were there. A Mandalorian army was assembled on Jebel, waiting to invade Alderaan. Pulsifar walked into the Mandalorian encampment at the Ice Citadel still wearing the necklace. The transformation field triggered. Thousands of Neo-Crusaders and recruits assembled for the Alderaan invasion began changing inside their armor, faster than any response could contain. Within hours, Jebel was a rock ghoul world. Carrick reached the communications dome and warned Cassius Fett that the plague could go galactic and that nothing could be allowed to land or leave. Fett was suspicious of a Jedi fugitive, but the warning was detailed enough to make him hesitate. Pulsifar captured Carrick and tried to interrogate him about the artifact's secrets, threatening to seal him inside an ancient Sith prison box Pulsifar had collected for his laboratory. The necklace sensed Carrick's Force sensitivity, detached from Pulsifar, and moved to attach to Carrick. The rock ghouls turned on Pulsifar and tore him apart. Morn arrived and tried to pry the necklace off Carrick. When she called its attention to herself by saying she was a Jedi, it reattached to her neck instead. Morn saw Karnes Mor's spirit the instant the talisman fastened into her flesh. Mor told her he was the future, and that she belonged to him now. Within minutes, she was sending the rock ghouls out to kill more Mandalorians. The amulet let her revive the skills the soldiers had before they were infected and direct them as an organized army against Fett's forces on the surface. Carrick and Hieroglyph watched her do it. Carrick had noticed the prison box in Pulsifar's lab, a sealed stasis chamber called Drapa's Oubliette. If he could seal Morn inside with the artifact still attached, the artifact would be out of play without her having to die, and the Covenant researchers on Odrin might find a way to remove it later. Morn, still lucid in flashes, agreed. She handed Carrick a key to the Covenant's secret artifact storehouse on Odrin and asked him to deliver her there. She also told him before the lid closed that she believed he had not killed the Padawans on Taurus. Carrick sealed the lid over her face, and the stasis field engaged. With the talisman's influence cut off, the rock ghouls outside lost their organization and turned on each other. Then, Cassius Fett made his own decision about Jebel. He had an infected world on his hands, and Carrick's warning had landed. He ordered a nuclear bombardment of the entire surface. The missiles fell, and the ice cracked. Everyone on the planet died inside the blast wave. The surface was sterilized down to bedrock, and the ice sheet melted into a steaming radioactive sea. Fett's fleet broke orbit and continued the war somewhere else. Carrick, who had gotten off the world with Hieroglyph before the bombardment, assumed Morn and the Talisman had been destroyed in the attack. He could not return to retrieve her, so he kept moving. She stayed there for nearly 4,000 years. Around 1400 BBY, ice miners working the refrozen planet dug into the buried ruins and found the sealed box under the permafrost. They did not know what it was, but it looked old. It looked valuable, and a stasis device like that was worth money. One of them killed his companions to take it off-world by himself. The oubliette drifted through the galaxy for generations, changing hands through blood and through trade. Owners who tried to open it failed because the locking mechanism was Sith-built and keyed to a Sith Lord, and the smugglers who wound up with the box had neither the knowledge nor the raw force strength to break the seal. Among antique dealers, the object picked up a name, the Jebel Box, and a legend that it contained a secret treasure of the Jedi Order. Prices rose with each sale, and blood was spilled over it more than once. While Morn endured it in the box, the galaxy she had been pulled out of finished collapsing and rebuilding itself around her 3 times over. She knew only the dark, the talisman, and Mor's voice. In 19 BBY, the box was in the hands of a smuggling crew. They had picked it up from a battlefield where a species had fought a war for it years earlier. After a failed sale to a crime lord and a 3-way firefight, the crew sold the box to a scholar named Fane Patori, not knowing he was an agent of Darth Vader. Then, Vader came for it. Patori, who had already worked out most of what the box was, delivered the oubliette to Vader. An old hologram recorded by Marn Hieroglyph referred to the object as Lord Drapa's oubliette, and Patori had concluded that it contained the Mor Talisman and a Jedi from 40 centuries past. He warned Vader, as the Dark Lord cut open the outer crate, not to open the box itself. Despite the warning, Vader opened it anyway. Morn woke up expecting Zane Carrick. Patori told her what had happened, that the Mandalorian Wars were thousands of years in the past, that the Republic had fallen, and that the Sith now ruled the galaxy. She took a long moment to process what she had been told. Then, she drew her lightsaber and attacked Vader. The duel was short. Vader disarmed her within the first few exchanges, and when he moved in to finish her, Morn reached for the talisman's power instead of her blade. The clone troopers standing around Vader transformed into rock ghouls in the space of a breath. The plague field swept outward faster than Vader could cut through it, and the Dark Lord of the Sith, caught between a woman he had just disarmed and a squad of his own men, now turned into Sith spawn, did the only thing left to do. He retreated. Empty-handed, Vader left the moon. Morn was stranded there with no ship and no way off, and the desert spread out around her in every direction. She walked the same ridgelines for nearly 20 years. Mor talked to her the entire time, and she had nothing else around her but the desert and the rock ghouls Vader's troops had become. Now her servants, her own mind weathered alongside theirs. He decided to use her against the rebels. He leaked information through a captured rebel spy about a secret Imperial weapon hidden on a desolate moon in the Outer Rim. The Rebel Alliance took the bait. Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia Organa led the team that came to investigate. About 9 months after the Battle of Yavin, Morn had spent nearly 20 years alone with Karness Mor, whispering in her ear, and she had gone insane over the decades. When Luke arrived on the moon, she attacked him, believed him a Jedi who would abandon her, and overpowered him quickly. Leia intervened before Morn could kill him. In the scuffle, the talisman came off Morn's neck and attached itself to Leia instead, and Mor, sensing a stronger Force user within reach, tried to possess her. Morn pulled the talisman off Leia and reattached it to her own neck, locking Mor back inside her. A rebel trooper named Abel charged Morn with blaster fire to save Leia, and Morn transformed him into a rock ghoul before he could fire again. The distraction gave Luke and Leia an opening to escape. Morn seized a rebel ship and left the moon with her rock ghouls. Then, another century passed. Morn was traveling deep into space when her ship was pulled from hyperspace by a Pelion-class star destroyer called the Iron Sun. She assumed the ship belonged to the same empire that Vader had served. She transformed the entire crew of 8,000 into rock ghouls, seized the vessel, and took it into a fractured hyperlane in the deep core, where she intended to hold Mur forever. By this point, a new Sith regime called the One Sith had taken power under a Dark Lord named Darth Krayt. Krayt had taken Coruscant and was running the galaxy from it. he was also dying. Decades earlier, Crait had been fitted with biological implants from the Yuuzhan Vong, an extragalactic species whose tissue grafting techniques had given him powers at a cost. The Vongbots were slowly consuming him from the inside, and no Sith alchemist in his own court could reverse the process. A young bounty hunter named Cade Skywalker, descended from Luke's line, had a personal interest in Crait's death. Cade's ship was pulled from hyperspace by the Iron Sun, and he and his crew were brought aboard, where they were attacked by Morn's rock ghouls. Cade and Azlyn Rae were both infected. When the plague began to transform them, Cade used a force healing technique called Dark Transfer to cleanse the virus from his own body and from Azlyn's. Morn had never seen anyone cure the Rakghoul plague. She joined Cade's crew. She had a plan, or Mur had a plan working through her. Speaking through Morn's voice, he sent a message to Darth Crait on Coruscant, offering to heal what was killing him in exchange for Crait's body as his new vessel. He also promised to deliver Cade Skywalker as a prisoner. Crait was to come alone to a dark side world called Had Abaddon. Emperor Rowan Fel, the deposed ruler leading the Imperial faction in rebellion against Crait, also learned of the talisman. Fel sent 3 of his Imperial knights, Antares Draco, Ganner Krieg, and Azlyn Rae, to recover it. Fel planned to use Mor's power to raise a Rakghoul army against Crait and reclaim his throne. The strike team on Had Abaddon assembled around Cade, Celeste Morn, the Jedi Knight Shadow Val, and Fel's 3 Imperial Knights, with additional support from Cade's crew. They attacked Crait's garrison on the planet to draw him into the trap. Believing he was being summoned to a meeting with Mur, Crait walked in. Crait was the most powerful Sith alive in his era, the one who had taken Coruscant and held it. He was also the Sith who could not heal what was killing him from inside, and the artifact had offered him exactly the thing his power could not deliver. The reigning Dark Lord of the Sith walked into a trap because Karness Moore had promised him survival. Crait arrived at Had Abaddon with 4 Sith Lords. He took Maladi, Strife, and Talon down to the surface and left Warlock in orbit, expecting Mur to hold up his end of the bargain. Mur, speaking through Morn, demonstrated his healing power on Crait long enough for the strike team to spring the trap. The Rakghouls Morn had already made of the Imperial garrison surged forward as Cade, Val, Draco, Krieg, and Rae emerged from the concealment. The fight scattered. Cade ended up against Talon. Draco broke from the others to grab the talisman for Fel and was forced pushed back by Morn before he could reach her. Crait himself fell on Morn, abandoning his lightsaber and exchanging Force lightning with her, while Maladi joined the assault. In the chaos, Azlyn Rae found her opening and drove her lightsaber through Crait's chest. Morn, still locked in the lightning exchange, unleashed a dark side torrent that caught both Crait and Rae. Rae went down burned and unconscious. Morn force pushed the weakened Crait off a cliff. Crait's surviving Sith Lords carried his body away. Everyone on Cade's side believed he was dead. Even then, the pattern held. Sith tried to use it, Jedi tried to contain it, and neither side was ever able to keep it safe. Morn had carried Karness Moore for 4,000 years. She had fulfilled her purpose for coming to Had Abaddon. Then she asked Cade to finish the rest of it. Karness Moore had spent 4,000 years inside her, slowly grinding through her resistance and waiting for her control to break. The moment had arrived. Morn could feel him taking ground inside her mind, and she knew that within hours she would be gone, and he would be running her body. Every Force user who had touched the talisman before her had been consumed by Mur in exactly this way. Morn was the first to see it coming and refused it. She carried the talisman across both her periods of wakefulness before and after the long sleep in the oubliette. Mur moved through her thoughts at a measured pace, visible to her but always one step ahead of any defense she could raise. Morn had watched him work on her in detail, and by the end, she knew there was nothing in her that could stop him. She told Cade Skywalker to kill her. Cade argued with her, but Morn explained that if he did not do it at that moment, Mur would take her over within hours, and Cade would be fighting an immortal Rakghoul commanding Sith Lord, wearing the body of the woman who had just helped him bring down Crait. With no other option left, Cade ignited his lightsaber and ran it through her. In the time it took the plasma blade to cool, her body disintegrated into dust. The talisman, which had been fastened into her flesh for 4,000 years, dropped free of the disintegrating corpse, extended its metal claws as legs, and crawled up Cade's arm towards his neck. Mor's voice started speaking into Cade's thoughts. The pitch was the same one he had made to Morn and to every Force user before her. Mor offered Cade immortality, an army of Rakghouls at his command, and guidance from the mental remnant of one of the Sith Order's founders. Cade could have everything he wanted, so long as he did not resist. Despite the offer, Cade refused, and then he used an ability that almost nobody in the galaxy still had. Shatterpoint was a rare force technique passed down through a small number of teachers over thousands of years, most famously practiced by the Jedi Master Mace Windu during the Clone Wars. A user could perceive the stress lines inside an object, a person, or a situation and see where the structure would fail if the right amount of force was applied at the right spot. Cade Skywalker, taught the technique by the Force ghost of his father Cole, had inherited the ability. He turned it on the talisman crawling up his arm. He saw the fault lines running through the metal and the bindings that held Moore's imprint inside the object. He poured force energy into those fault points until the bindings cracked apart and the talisman broke. Moore's imprint, untethered from the metal that had been holding it together for thousands of years, came apart with the object. The rock ghoul plague itself continued to spread through the galaxy in its virus form, but Moore was done, and the box that had held Morn had a builder. Drapa's oubliette, the stasis coffin Zane Carrick had sealed Morn inside on Jebel, had been designed for one specific purpose. Remulus Drapa was a Baron and an Admiral, a Jedi who had fallen to the dark side during the 100-Year Darkness. He was exiled after the Battle of Corbus alongside Karness Moore and Sorza's Sin, and helped found the old Sith Empire on Korriban with the others. At some point during those early years, Drapa built the oubliette to imprison Moore and contain the hypnotic influence of the talisman. The stasis chamber was designed specifically against the Moore talisman's properties and could hold a wearer indefinitely. Drapa put it into the field. When Vader cut open the oubliette on the desert moon, Moore's first reaction, on being released, was to curse Drapa by name for building the prison. Through her connection to Moore, Morn recognized that the oubliette had been built by Drapa for exactly this purpose, and willingly entered the device. Celeste Morn's body was gone. The talisman was broken. Karness Moore, whose spirit had waited 4,000 years for a body strong enough to take over, was finally quiet. The pieces sat on the ground at Hat Abaddon, and nothing came to collect them. The dark side rewarded the pursuit of power without limit. A Sith who refused to build a dangerous weapon because it might destroy other Sith would be choosing restraint over capability, and restraint was incompatible with the doctrine. The whole point of the Rule of Two and the Sith codes that came before it was that the strength gets proven by what you can wield, take, and dominate. A weapon too dangerous for your own side to control was never going to deter a Sith who believed the next wielder would prove strong enough. Relics like those were dangers that someone chose to build. Not everything strange in the galaxy came from a workshop though. In its most remote and isolated corners, life took shapes that seem impossible on paper, from a slug that eats through solid buildings to a predator that feeds on the Force itself. These are the 20 strangest creatures ever recorded. In the lower levels of Coruscant, entire walls occasionally collapse for no apparent reason. Engineers investigating these failures sometimes discover winding tunnels bored directly through support structures that were designed to last for centuries. The damage does not resemble explosives or machinery. Instead, the interior surfaces appear melted and rehardened, as though the structure itself had been slowly eaten from the inside. The organism responsible is the Duracrete slug, a pale, burrowing lifeform that feeds on the same composite material used to construct the planet-wide city. Rather than living in soil or stone, the creature treats architecture as its natural environment. It moves through buildings by secreting corrosive digestive fluids that break down Duracrete, Ferrocrete, and other construction compounds. As the material is processed, the slug excretes the materials through its skin, forming a dense shell that gradually thickens as the animal grows. Urban planners rarely design cities with burrowing organisms that eat the buildings themselves, but some parasites are even more invasive, choosing not to hollow out structures, but to take control of living bodies. A brain beetle crawls quietly across the surface of a fallen creature before slipping beneath the skull through a natural opening. Once inside, the parasite begins interacting directly with the host's nervous system. Legend sources describing unusual parasitic organisms mention the brain beetle as one of the more disturbing examples. These small arthropods survive by inserting themselves into the cranial cavities of larger animals, where they stimulate nerve pathways to control basic motor functions. The host body continues to move as if it were alive. Limbs respond to stimuli, eyes can still track motion, and the creature may even continue walking or feeding depending on how intact the nervous system remains. To an outside observer, the animal appears normal at first glance, which is part of what allows the parasite to survive undetected. Creatures like this blur the line between parasite and puppeteer. Another lifeform survives in a far stranger way, thriving in the harsh machinery that provides water on desert worlds. A vaporator slug coils around the interior piping of a moisture vaporator, absorbing the minerals that accumulate inside the machinery. To settlers depending on these devices for survival, the presence of such an organism can quickly become a serious problem. In Legends descriptions of life on Tatooine, colonists occasionally discover these slugs living inside the equipment used to harvest water from the atmosphere. The animals are drawn to the mineral residue left behind during the vapor condensation process. Soft and flexible tissue allows the slug to move through narrow mechanical channels. Specialized digestive enzymes break down mineral deposits, enabling the creature to extract nutrients directly from the metal-lined pipes. Its feeding slowly erodes the internal surfaces of the machinery. Over time, the slug widens small mineral cavities into hollow chambers large enough for its body to coil inside. Hidden within the sealed structure of the device, it can go unnoticed for months. Parasites hiding inside survival equipment can threaten a community without ever being seen. Larger predators, however, make their presence known immediately, and the next one is huge enough to be ridden across open terrain. A Sleen moves across the desert with a long, muscular body carried on powerful limbs. Its reptilian head sweeps slowly from side to side as it scans the terrain ahead. In legend sources, Sleens are associated with swamp environments, and one trained Sleen named Shadow was kept on Drummond Cos. The creature can maintain a steady pace over uneven ground, which makes a trained specimen valuable to a handler moving through a difficult landscape, while Sleen remain formidable predators that rely on their strength and speed to overpower prey in open terrain. Their presence in swamp habitats places them among the larger hunters of those environments. Creatures like the Sleen show how even formidable predators can be integrated into daily life on frontier worlds. Some organisms, however, remain impossible to control, and the next one waits motionless beneath the sand for prey to fall into its grasp. A Sarlacc rests beneath the sands of Tatooine, with only its gaping mouth exposed at the surface. Rows of inward curving teeth circle a deep funnel-shaped pit in the desert, while thick, muscular tentacles emerge whenever the sand shifts too close to the edge. The movie Return of the Jedi places the Great Pit of Carkoon as the center of Jabba the Hutt's Theater of Horror, a public execution site built around an organism already waiting below. Luke Skywalker and Han Solo narrowly escaped the pit during Jabba's failed attempt to feed them to the creature. The Sarlacc is a complex organism that has existed since Tatooine's early eras. In Legends lore, it is even capable of a twisted form of telepathy, merging its consciousness with its victims so they remain mentally aware during the centuries under its slow digestion. Most of the Sarlacc's body lies deep beneath the desert floor. Its mouth forms a vertical shaft lined with rows of mucus-covered teeth that point downward, making escape physically impossible once a victim slides past the rim. Beneath the sand, the organism extends a network of roots through the surrounding soil, drawing moisture and nutrients to supplement its diet of flesh. A labyrinthine stomach lined with enzymes breaks down organic matter at a glacial pace. This slow metabolism allows the Sarlacc to survive for thousands of years on little food, making it one of the most efficient and horrifying predators in the Outer Rim. Those crossing the Dune Sea mark Sarlacc pits in their star charts and maps. The sand may conceal a predator that has been waiting in the same spot since the era of the Old Republic. A patch of desert becomes a sentence once cartilage, roots, and digestive slime are waiting underneath it. What follows is a hunter that refuses to stay rooted anywhere, turning sealed transport decks into places where every wall can suddenly matter. A Rathtar drags itself down a narrow corridor with coiling, slime-covered tentacles, reeling victims inward until they disappear into its gaping mouth. These creatures are the embodiment of pure, unthinking hunger. They move using their suction-padded limbs to navigate the ceilings and floors of starships. In the cold metal hallways of a freighter, the sound of a Rathtar is a wet, slapping cadence that signals an inescapable end for anyone it catches. In the film The Force Awakens, Han Solo and Chewbacca attempted to transport 3 captured Rathtars when a containment failure let them loose among armed smugglers and gang enforcers. The Rathtars hunted the mercenaries with relentless, pack-like efficiency. Rathtars have a spherical mass of hyper-dense muscle without a single rigid bone. Thick, sensory-rich tentacles surround the central body, and each limb can grip metal surfaces or crush armor through powerful suction pads. The creature's tentacles coil and tighten around its prey, dragging the victim towards a circular mouth lined with rows of serrated teeth. Stories surrounding the infamous Trilia massacre helped build the Rathtar's reputation as the most dangerous cargo in the entire world. During that event, a small group of Rathtars decimated an entire colony in a matter of hours. Despite this, smugglers pay exorbitant prices for these living weapons, using them as final deterrents or status symbols. However, as Han Solo learned, the cost of carrying a Rathtar is often paid in the lives of the crew, as no cage in the galaxy is truly Rathtar-proof once the creature smells food. A ship full of compartments becomes useless when the thing pursuing you can grip every surface at once. After that comes a life form that makes shelter itself the mistake, because the cave ahead is really a throat. An exogorth holds its enormous mouth open within the hollowed-out shell of an asteroid, waiting for minerals, debris, or a stray starship to fly inside. These silicon-based behemoths are among the largest life forms in the galaxy, capable of growing to lengths of nearly 900 meters. They do not breathe oxygen or require a pressurized atmosphere, thriving instead in the cold vacuum of space. They anchor to the interior of rocky planetoids where they can safely digest the ores of their habitat. To a pilot seeking refuge, the entrance to an exogorth's gullet looks like a jagged cave, but the stone floor is actually a layer of reactive, translucent muscle. In the film The Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo piloted the Millennium Falcon into what appeared to be a gigantic, hollow asteroid while escaping a relentless Imperial blockade, only to discover that the cavern walls were part of a living predator. Their skin is thick enough to withstand the bombardment of micrometeoroids and the intense radiation of deep space. A circular opening ringed with massive, calcified teeth leads into digestive chambers where powerful acids break down raw minerals and ship hulls alike. Lacking a traditional respiratory system, it breathes by absorbing stellar winds through its skin, turning solar energy into the chemical fuel needed to drive its massive muscles. In the Anuat system and the Hoth asteroid belt, the space slug remains the ultimate apex predator of the void. In the vacuum of space, even the terrain can be alive and hungry. A pilot looking for cover can land inside something older, softer, and far more patient than stone. Smaller parasites follow next, and they do not need an asteroid when a power line will do. The Mynock is a silicon-based parasite that breathes electrical current and survives the vacuum of deep space by metabolizing starship fuel. It exists in a state of non-stop hunger for raw energy, making it the primary menace of long-haul freighter pilots and deep space explorers. To a Mynock, a light freighter is a floating banquet of high-voltage power lines and fusion reactor leakage. In the canon film The Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo and Princess Leia discovered an infestation of these creatures, which highlighted the Mynock's most problematic trait, its ability to latch onto a hull and remain undetected while it systematically drains the ship's reserves. In swarms, a single Mynock is rarely the issue, but a dozen or more will converge on a ship's power conduits, which can lead to engine failure or the total breakdown of life support systems. Its biology departs from most vacuum life in one crucial way. It breathes by absorbing ions and electrical particles directly through its skin and its specialized feeding mouth. This mouth functions as a biological ground wire. Once it seals against a power cable or a ship's hull, it creates a closed circuit, letting the Mynock siphon energy directly into its own nervous system. Furthermore, their wings are not used for flight, but act as solar sails and thermal radiators to regulate internal temperature. The danger of the Mynock is its rapid reproductive cycle when exposed to high-energy environments. If a Mynock manages to get inside a ship's engineering deck, it can split into two separate organisms within hours by overfeeding on the ship's reactor. To remove them, crews often have to use high-intensity ultraviolet light or manual scrapers, as the Mynock's grip is chemically reinforced to withstand hyperspace travel. Out in vacuum, even a minor parasite can strip a vessel down to failing systems. Another survivor prefers rot, sludge, and the place's maintenance crews hate to inspect. Most famously known as the trash monster of the Death Star, the Dianoga is a highly adaptable survivor found in sewers, garbage compactors, and toxic swamps across the galaxy. The Dianoga is a master of camouflage, possessing a translucent, gelatinous body that takes on the color and texture of the sludge it inhabits. This cephalopod-like scavenger has a hydroskeletal frame and a single retractable sensory stalk that can rotate 360 degrees. It can grow up to 10 meters in length, while hiding in a pool of waste only a few meters deep. In the canon film A New Hope, Luke Skywalker was nearly drowned by a Dianoga residing in the Death Star's trash compactor. The creature was later identified in the canon short story The Baptist as Omi, a rare, semi-sentient member of the species. Omi possessed a crude connection to the Force, viewing the encounter with Luke as a spiritual event rather than a simple predatory attack. What sets the Dianoga apart is its biological adaptability to toxicity. It grows in environments that would be lethal to almost any other organism, including heavy metal runoff, raw sewage, and radioactive waste. Its skin is coated in a specialized mucus that neutralizes most industrial chemicals, so it can consume bacteria and organic matter found in garbage without suffering poisoning. The Dianoga pulls water through its body, moving silently without creating ripples on the surface. Its tentacles are lined with sensory pits that detect minute pressure waves, meaning it can hear the heartbeat of a creature standing by its pool. For maintenance crews, the only sign of its presence is often the faint, rhythmic thumping of its heart against the pipes. Beneath floating garbage and chemical runoff, an eye on a stalk can keep an entire pool under watch. At a glance, the following creature appears harmless, but some birds in this galaxy trail stranger currents than any predator does. The Convor is a small, owl-like avian that occupies a unique intersection between natural biology and cosmic mysticism. While they are physically native to worlds like Adelon and the moon of Waska, their significance comes from their role as spiritual barometers. A common freighter pilot sees a Convor as a feathered predator with a curved beak and a distinctive hoot. Force-sensitive observers often read far more into their presence. They're treated as manifestations of destiny, specifically tied to the Daughter, a powerful embodiment of the light side from the realm of Mortis. Morai, the most notable individual of the species, has shadowed Ahsoka Tano for decades. Morai's behavior defies standard avian ecology. She does not hunt for sustenance or seek out mates. Instead, she appears at pivotal historical junctures, acting as a silent witness to the tides of the Force. Morai was present during the Siege of Malachor and was even seen perched near the entrance to the World Between Worlds, a mystical dimension that exists outside of normal time and space. Physically, Convories are remarkably silent. They have a broad wingspan and gold-rimmed eyes that are highly effective at tracking movement in low-light environments. Their calls and appearances have been interpreted by some Force-sensitive observers as signs that important events are unfolding around them. While standard Convories on Waska might feed on small lizards, Morai's repeated appearances around major Force events makes her behavior difficult to explain through ordinary animal habits alone. Morai makes an ordinary silhouette carry the weight of prophecy. The next organism strips away free will altogether and leaves a body moving on borrowed commands. The Geonosian brainworm represents a horrific fusion of parasitic biology and hive mind necromancy. Unlike typical parasites that only consume nutrients, these pale, segmented invertebrates seek total neural control. They serve as the physical extensions of a Geonosian queen's will, allowing her to project command across vast distances. Its biology transforms a standard medical infection into a state of absolute mental and physical enslavement. As seen in the canon animated series The Clone Wars, the brainworm does not require a living host. By burrowing into a cadaver and stimulating the brainstem with electrical impulses, the parasite can reanimate the deceased. These undead hosts, whether Geonosian or clone trooper, exhibit a distinctive jerky gait as the worm manually overrides the motor cortex, telepathically linked to a central queen. An infested squad moves with a singular, terrifying coordination, making them far more lethal than standard mindless ghouls. The infection process is a showcase of invasive evolution. The worm typically enters a sleeping or restrained host through the nasal cavity, maneuvering towards the base of the skull. Once positioned, it deploys microscopic hook nodes to anchor itself directly into the host's central nervous system. It then secretes a cocktail of neuroinhibitors that paralyze the host's conscious mind while keeping the autonomic functions and motor skills fully operational. The result is a passenger effect in which the victim remains aware but possesses zero control over their actions, even as their body is forced to fire on allies or sabotage equipment. The only reliable defense against this biological takeover is extreme cold. Having evolved in the sweltering subterranean heat of Geonosis, the brainworm's cellular membranes are highly susceptible to thermal shock. Sub-zero temperatures induce immediate paralysis in the parasite, forcing it to relinquish its neural grip. Without this thermal vulnerability, the brainworm would be an unstoppable agent of hive expansion, capable of hollowing out an entire military force from the inside out. Parasitic rule becomes military doctrine when a queen can march the dead through borrowed flesh. This next one is worse for a different reason. It turns pain into part of the protection. The Orbalisk is a rare force-sensitive parasite that transforms into armor. Primarily found on the moon of Duxan, these hard-shelled mollusks are not interested in blood or tissue. They want the specific flavor of a person's connection to the Force. For a Sith Lord, an infestation of Orbalisks is both a crowning achievement and a biological prison. The creatures attach themselves to the skin and begin to multiply rapidly, covering the host in overlapping organic plate mail that defies standard physics. In the Darth Bane trilogy of Legends continuity, the Orbalisk becomes the defining feature of Bane's physical presence. After being attacked by the parasites in a Sith tomb, Bane discovered that the creatures provided him with a nearly perfect defense. An Orbalisk's shell is naturally resistant to lightsaber blades. However, this protection comes at a horrific cost. The Orbalisks are not passive creatures. They inject a constant stream of adrenaline and life-prolonging chemicals into the host to keep them in a perpetual state of agony and fury. The spike in negative emotion generates an enormous feed of dark side energy, which the Orbalisks then consume to fuel their own rapid growth. Once an Orbalisk has latched itself onto a host, it cannot be removed through traditional surgery. If the parasite detects a threat to its attachment, it releases a concentrated dose of neurotoxin into the host's bloodstream. This toxin is so potent that it can kill even a powerful Force user in seconds. Orbalisks also expand until they cover every inch of the body, including the face and joints, threatening to suffocate the host unless they are carefully managed or stunted through specialized Sith alchemy. Protection stops feeling like a gift when the shell on your skin is alive and feeding on your worst impulses. After that comes a hunter that does not need tracks, scent, or open ground to find what it wants. The Vornsker is a canine-like apex predator that has weaponized the Force into a primary sensory organ for tracking prey. This creature exists in a state of constant attunement to the ripples caused by living minds. Native to the planet Merkur, this creature has evolved in a biological arms race against the Ysolamiri, the Force-nullifying lizards. In the Thrawn trilogy from the Legends timeline, the Vornsker was one of the few creatures that can truly unnerve a Jedi. When Luke Skywalker was stranded in the forests of Merkur, he found that his usual methods of stealth were useless. Its unusual adaptation lies in specialized neural architecture. A cluster of Force-sensitive cells within the brain functions like a biological receiver. This organ is tuned specifically to the signatures of Force users, which the Vornsker perceives as a hunger-inducing stimulus. Jedi and Sith have a higher concentration of Force energy, so they shine like beacons to the Predator, often provoking it into a frenzy. Physically, the Vornsker is a sleek, quadrupedal mammal with a whip-like tail. Its coat is dark and coarse, allowing it to blend into the shadows of the Olbio trees. However, its most striking feature is its aggression. Unlike most animals that hunt for food, Vornskers often attack for the sport of the Force chase, even when they're not hungry. This erratic violence made them ideal tools for Grand Admiral Thrawn, who recognized that their instincts could locate Jedi targets otherwise invisible to Imperial sensors. The Vornsker's relationship with its environment is a perfect example of coevolution. Vornskers are such effective Force trackers that their primary prey, the Ilismiri, evolved the ability to project bubbles of Force neutrality. This creates a dead zone on Merkur where the Vornsker is essentially blinded if its prey remains within the protective field. On Merkur, being strong in the Force can make you easier to stalk, not safer. The creature after it goes one step further by removing itself from that entire sensory web. The Tausen is a huge invertebrate that exists as a black hole in the Force, rendering it and anyone near it completely undetectable to psychic senses. While many creatures use camouflage to hide from the eye, the Tausen uses a form of metabiological stealth to hide from the soul. Native to the lightless caverns of the Outer Rim, this giant centipede-like organism has evolved a translucent exoskeleton that refracts both light and Force energy, making it a literal ghost in the machinery of the universe. Dozens of pairs of hooked legs drive the Tausen forward with unsettling speed. Its body is elongated and serpentine, often reaching lengths of over 20 meters. In addition to its force-shrouding abilities, it is a formidable physical hunter. It produces a thick, adhesive silk from glands near its mandibles, which it uses to ensnare prey in transparent webs. The web is as invisible to the Force as the creature, so Jedi often find themselves entangled in a trap they never felt coming. The Tauzen is a walking piece of anti-Force technology. Some organisms do not camouflage their bodies so much as erase their presence from the galaxy's deepest signal. The following creature is impossible to miss: a storm dweller whose scale makes freighters look disposable. The Summa Verminoth is a titanic spacefaring predator that lives in the treacherous maelstrom surrounding Kessel. It has the ability to project lethal mental hallucinations in the minds of Starship crews. As seen in the Canon film Solo: A Star Wars Story, the Summa Verminoth doesn't have a traditional skeletal structure. Its body is surrounded by a cloud of electrified gas and debris, which manipulates it using its large tentacles to pull ships towards its central maw. The creature's scale and sudden movement through the storm can overwhelm pilots before they have time to react. Its biology is rooted in the Acades maelstrom itself. It feeds on the intense radiation and energy found within the rift. It does not eat in the traditional sense. It absorbs the raw energy of the maelstrom through its skin. Its tentacles are tipped with specialized suction claws that can crush durasteel hulls, while the limbs themselves function as sensory feelers within the storm, which makes the creature a living navigational hazard. In the maelstrom, the thing reaching for your hull is the only part you can actually see. After that comes a life form that spreads like rot and thinks like a colony. A Drengir pushes a thorny vine through the soft soil, its body expanding like an invasive weed that refuses to die. The creature does not have a heart or a brain in the traditional sense. It is a mass of sentient vegetation that views all meat-based life as spoiled food, waiting to be harvested. During the era of the High Republic, the Jedi Order encountered the Drengir as one of the greatest threats to the frontier. These plant-based monsters were originally trapped in stasis by the ancient Sith, but they were inadvertently awakened, leading to an infestation that threatened entire star systems. Unlike a simple beast, the Drengir act with collective hunger, leaving lush worlds into gray, thorny graveyards. They sit on the razor's edge between a mindless fungus and an evil intelligence. The Drengir is a chaotic tangle of roots, thorns, and hidden mouths. They have a central root mind but can move through individual pods that sprout from the ground. Their skin is a thick, bark-like hide that is highly resistant to lightsabers and blaster fire. Cutting a Drengir often just results in two separate pieces of the plant growing back into two separate creatures. They communicate through a shared consciousness that allows them to coordinate attacks across a battlefield, using vine limbs to trap and pull victims into the dark, thorny mass of their central bodies. The Drengir's ability to corrupt other life forms makes them especially difficult to contain. They can extend mind vines that tap into the nervous systems of other creatures, forcing them to do the hive's bidding. To the Drengir, the galaxy is a garden that has grown out of control, and they are the gardeners who come to prune the meat from the stars. They are nearly impossible to eradicate because even a single surviving seed can restart an infestation. For the Jedi of the High Republic, fighting them was not a war of blasters, but a struggle against an unstoppable biological rot that viewed the entire galaxy as a meal. A world can stop feeling habitable once those roots take hold. The next creature is gentler, but no less unsettling, because it crossed the stars before anyone built an engine. The Purrgil is a massive, semi-sentient spacefaring creature that bridges the gap between biological life and interstellar travel. Resembling a cross between a whale and a cephalopod, these behemoths thrive in the vacuum of space, using their large fins and 4 powerful tentacles to maneuver through the stars. While most life forms require pressurized hulls and life support, the Purrgil's physiology is evolved for the void. Their most distinctive adaptation is their diet. They consume Clauson-36, a rare gas found in planetary nebulae. This gas reacts within specialized internal organs to generate the energy required for natural hyperspace travel, a process called simu-tunneling. In the canon animated series Star Wars Rebels, the Purrgil proved their intelligence when Ezra Bridger used a force bond to coordinate a pod of them against the Imperial 7th Fleet. By wrapping their tentacles around Star Destroyers, they dragged entire vessels into hyperspace. This suggests they do not merely blink through space, but have a sophisticated understanding of hyperspace lanes. In fact, many historians believe that the earliest sentient species developed hyperdrive technology by studying Purrgil migration patterns, mapping the galaxy's highways based on where these massive creatures naturally travel to feed. Despite their size, Purrgil are generally peaceful unless provoked or interrupted during their feeding cycles. Their bodies are covered in a thick, leathery hide that can withstand the radiation of deep space, and their eyes glow with a soft bioluminescence that helps them navigate dark nebulae. However, they are a notorious hazard to commercial shipping. Their tendency to drift into established hyperspace lanes has caused countless collisions. To the average pirate, they are a pest. To the Jedi, they are a profound example of how the Force binds all life, even in the cold reaches of the vacuum. Living bodies can do what Navi computers do, and they do it by instinct. What follows presence drops all softness and wonder. It arrives like a fault in reality itself. The Star Weird is a semi-corporeal manifestation of pure malevolence that haunts the vacuum of deep space and derelict vessels. Described in Legends material as space ghosts, these entities are non-sentient but highly predatory. Physically, they appear as tall, gaunt humanoids with skeletal features, elongated talons, and white hair that drifts as if submerged in water. Their defining trait is selective intangibility. A Star Weird exists partially out of phase with normal reality, allowing blaster bolts and physical strikes to pass through its form without causing damage. The most terrifying aspect of a Star Weird is its psychic scream. Because sound cannot travel in a vacuum, the entity projects a telepathic shriek directly into the minds of its prey. This scream is not just a sound, but a mental assault that induces paralyzing dread. It can cause immediate physiological collapse or cardiac arrest in non-Force sensitives. However, Star Weirds reserve a unique, instinctual hatred for those who can touch the Force. One will often ignore a ship's entire crew to focus exclusively on a Jedi or a Sith, entering a state of hyper-aggressive frenzy until the Force-sensitive individual is neutralized. The origin of these creatures remains a mystery. Some xenotheorists suggest they are glitches in the Force, while others believe they are remnants of ancient dark side experiments. They do not eat, breathe, or sleep. They only drift through the void, waiting for the presence of a sentient mind to trigger their hunting instinct. Encountering a Star Weird is often a death sentence for spacers. By the time the sudden chilling ringing begins in their minds, the entity has already phased through the hull, ready to tear through both flesh and spirit. Deep space turns malignant when a thing can ignore your hull and scream straight into your mind. Only one familiar creature sits above it, because small size means nothing when biology can shut the Force off. The Ysolmiri is a small, furry lizard native to the trees of the planet Merkur, possessing a biological adaptation that defies the laws of the galaxy. Unlike almost every other living thing, the Ysolmiri does not just exist within the Force, it repels it. To survive the predatory Vornskurs, which hunt by sensing the Force signatures of their prey, the Ysolmiri evolved the ability to project a Force-neutral bubble. Within this radius, the Force simply ceases to function. This makes the creature one of the most effective biological defenses against Force users, as it effectively severs their connection to the cosmic energy field. Grand Admiral Thrawn famously weaponized this biology during his campaign against the New Republic. By mounting Ysolmiri on specialized nutrient frames, he could carry the creatures into battle, creating a mobile dead zone that rendered Jedi like Luke Skywalker powerless. In a large enough group, multiple Ysolmiri can overlap their bubbles to create massive voids in the Force spanning several kilometers. For a Jedi, entering this field is a traumatic experience described as a sudden crushing sensory deprivation, leaving them physically vulnerable and mentally disoriented. The strangeness of the Ysolmiri's metabolism is so extreme that it actually pushes back against the Force. More than a simple mental block, it is a physical displacement of the Force's presence. Because they are sedentary and spend their lives firmly anchored to the mineral-rich bark of Merkur's trees, they are difficult to remove without killing them. However, their utility as a tactical asset makes them one of the most dangerous non-predatory animals in existence. In a galaxy governed by mystical energy, the most powerful creature is the one that can make that energy vanish. A branch on Merkur can become a dead zone for the most powerful mystics in the galaxy, and even that defense looks gentle beside what comes next. Because the final predator doesn't silence the Force, it eats it. Introduced in the High Republic era, the Nameless are the apex predators of the Jedi Order. Also known as the Shri Karai, or Eaters of the Force, these pale, multi-limbed horrors do not hunt for meat. They feed exclusively on the Force energy within living beings. When a Nameless enters the vicinity of a Force sensitive, it projects an aura of pure, unadulterated terror that causes the victim's connection to the Force to fracture. This results in horrific hallucinations and the loss of all Force-derived abilities, leaving even the most powerful Jedi Masters cowering and helpless. The feeding process is hellish. As the creature consumes the victim's inner light, the host undergoes a rapid calcification process. Once the Force energy is completely drained, the victim is reduced to a brittle, gray husk, a statue of ash that crumbles into dust at the slightest touch. There is no known biological defense against this consumption. The Nameless are eyeless and appear to see the galaxy through the vibrations and signatures of the Force itself, making them impossible to hide from for anyone with even a slight Force sensitivity. The Nameless become even more unsettling because of their origin and their relationship to the dark side. While they appear monstrous, they are not necessarily evil in a moral sense. They are a natural check on the Force, existing as a void that must be filled. They were used by the Nihil Marauders to devastating effect, nearly breaking the Jedi Order during its golden age. The discovery of the Nameless shattered the Jedi's perception of themselves as invincible guardians. The very power they relied upon was exactly what made them the perfect prey. A creature like that can end a Jedi, a ship, or a whole settlement. Whole civilizations, though, have fallen to single moments that no predator could ever cause. Some of these were weapons, some were accidents, and a few were chosen on purpose. Yet each one changed the galaxy for good. These are the 12 worst disasters in its history.
Jedha held no military value, but it carried spiritual meaning for the entire galaxy. In the film Rogue One, the city was tied to ancient Force traditions and held Kyber crystal sites older than the Jedi Order itself. For thousands of years, pilgrims from hundreds of worlds visited Jedha to learn that the Force belonged to everyone, not just Jedi or Sith. Then the Death Star test changed everything. Director Krennic ordered the station to fire at low power because the Empire wanted proof that Kyber-powered weapons worked at a large scale. The city was gone. The planet survived, but millions did not. In an instant, the blast damaged the air and caused huge harm across the region. Ancient temples vanished, and records holding centuries of Force knowledge disappeared in seconds. As a result, this event proved the Death Star worked. The weapon could be set to wipe out a city or an entire planet, and fear spread across the galaxy even before the official word came out. However, this was only the beginning. The next target proved the Empire would give up even its own property to stay in control. The Battle of Scarif was a fight where both sides lost everything they brought. In Rogue One, Scarif served as the Empire's main data storage base and held the most secret Imperial records, including the Death Star plans. A huge shield gate protected the world from orbit, making ground attacks impossible without first winning the control of space. Despite these odds, the Rebel Alliance attacked anyway. They sent their entire strike force with no escape plan because everyone understood the risks. Their goal was simple but desperate: send the Death Star plans off-world before Imperial backup arrived. Rebels fought on the beaches of Scarif to buy time for a single data transfer that could change the war. Against all odds, they succeeded. The plans reached the Rebel fleet moments before the Death Star arrived. Then, the Empire wiped out everything. The film shows a single blast clearing the entire surface base. Rather than let the Rebels keep what they had found, the Empire gave up its own records, its own workers, and the Rebel ground forces all at once. This victory came at a huge cost for both sides. The Death Star plans let the Rebels find a weakness in the battle station, leading to its end at Yavin. At the same time, the Rebel Alliance lost skilled fighters, trained pilots, and resources that it can never replace. In the end, the rebellion came out weaker in numbers, but armed with proof that the Empire would give up anything to hold power. But worse was still to come. The next event showed the Empire would wipe out entire worlds without pause. Alderaan chose peace and paid the ultimate price for it. In the film A New Hope, The planet had no shields and no military. Its people lived in open cities on a defenseless world. For centuries, this choice had made Alderaan strong as a center of culture, art, and learning because it posed no threat to anyone. Then the Death Star fired at full power. The planet broke apart completely. In the film, Alderaan is shown coming apart from the inside out. The surface cracked, the core blew up, and within seconds, the entire world became a field of broken pieces. Billions of lives ended at once with no warning and no chance to escape. This attack came just days after the Empire had shut down the Imperial Senate. With Alderaan gone and the Senate closed, the message was clear. The Empire no longer needed to pretend that it served the people, and fear would replace cooperation as the basis of Imperial rule. Grand Moff Tarkin believed wiping out one world would scare thousands into giving up. Fear did spread, and neutral systems understood the threat. However, terror also creates resistance. Systems that might have stayed neutral now faced only two choices: give in completely or fight back. Many chose to fight, and the Rebel Alliance grew stronger after Alderaan rather than weaker. Officers left the Empire and joined the Rebels, while resources flowed in from systems that had never supported the rebellion before. To this day, later canon sources confirm that Alderaan's broken pieces remain visible as a lasting reminder that some choices cannot be undone. Yet, Alderaan was not the first great loss that the galaxy had faced. Years before Alderaan, a different kind of loss had already reshaped the galaxy. The Jedi Order had protected the galaxy for over 1,000 generations and was wiped out in a single day. Both Revenge of the Sith and the Clone Wars show that the Order numbered in the thousands and had served as peacekeepers of the Galactic Republic. They kept temples across many worlds and saved knowledge of the Force going back to the earliest written records. Then, Order 66 ended all of it. Across the galaxy, clone soldiers turned on their Jedi commanders at the exact same moment. This betrayal was especially hard because the Jedi had trusted the clone army completely after fighting together for years. Jedi Masters knew individual clones by name and had shared victories, losses, and countless battles together. Yet the series reveals that the clones had no choice in what happened. Control chips placed in them during their creation forced them to obey when the order came. The Jedi did not know about the chips. They only saw soldiers they had trusted turning weapons against them without warning and without mercy. As a result, within hours, Jedi Masters were gone on distant battlefields, and Council members were overwhelmed in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The few Jedi who survived did so through luck, quick thinking, or the help of clones who managed to resist their programming. The losses went far beyond the immediate count. Beyond the immediate losses, the Jedi Order lost everything it had built over thousands of years. Training centers were seized or shut down, and records holding gathered wisdom came under Sith control. Holocrons, special devices holding the recorded teachings of past Jedi Masters, were taken or broken. Making matters worse, canon sources including Rebels and Obi-Wan Kenobi show that children born with Force abilities faced a terrible fate in the years that followed. Imperial Inquisitors hunted them across the galaxy. Those who escaped grew up hiding their gifts because they were afraid to use abilities they did not understand. With no Jedi to oppose them, Palpatine and Vader controlled how the entire galaxy understood the Force. The light side became a myth, while the dark side became the only known path to power. This situation lasted for nearly 2 decades. Even so, the galaxy's suffering was not over. When Palpatine finally fell, he made sure the galaxy would suffer one more time. Both the Shattered Empire comic series and the game Battlefront 2 confirmed that Palpatine planned for his own end, but did not try to prevent it. Instead, he made sure the galaxy would be punished for allowing it to happen. Once word of the Emperor's end reached the Imperial Command, Operation Cinder started on its own. There was no review, no discussion, and no chance to reconsider. The plan Palpatine had prepared years in advance simply began. The targets were not rebel bases or enemy worlds, but rather loyal Imperial planets. Planets that had supported the Empire faithfully for decades suddenly found themselves marked for harm. According to Canon sources, weather control satellites deployed across these worlds, creating huge storms, terrible flooding, and widespread crop failures. Unlike the Death Star, the harm happened slowly over days rather than seconds. People watched the storms approach and understood what was happening, but they had no way to stop it. The purpose was punishment rather than military gain. As a result, Operation Cinder ended whatever trust remained in the Empire. Worlds that had been loyal watched Imperial forces attack Imperial citizens. The message was impossible to ignore. The Empire had never protected its own, and it never would. Because of this, no stable Imperial government could follow Palpatine. Officers found themselves commanding forces that had just attacked loyal populations, and the political center fell apart completely. Canon sources confirm that Operation Cinder served no military purpose at all. It gained no territory, defeated no enemies, and reached no military goal. It existed only to cause suffering as Palpatine's final act. In time, the galaxy began to heal. The New Republic eventually rose from the chaos, but decades later, history repeated itself. The New Republic was erased before it even knew it was under attack. The Force Awakens reveals that the New Republic chose to rotate its capital between member worlds to prevent any single planet from gaining too much power. Different systems took turns hosting the government. When the First Order fired at Starkiller Base, the Hosnian system held the rotating capital. The timing was on purpose because the First Order had waited for exactly this moment. The weapon fired through hyperspace, which meant that there was no approaching threat that sensors could detect. There was no warning of any kind, and the beam arrived in the Hosnian system before anyone knew to be afraid. An entire star system was gone in seconds. In seconds, multiple planets vanished at once, and the Republic fleet stationed in the system was lost completely. The Senate building was erased, along with everyone inside. Every elected leader, every government worker, and every record was gone. Military command failed right away as officers in distant systems waited for orders that would never come because no one remained to give them. This event ended more than lives and buildings. It ended the government itself. When Alderaan was gone decades earlier, the Imperial Senate still existed briefly, and some structure remained. In contrast, the Hosnian loss left nothing at all. There was no backup capital waiting and no plan for what came next. The New Republic's ability to respond as a unified government ended completely in those few seconds. In the aftermath, the First Order rose without real opposition. Individual systems faced the same choice their grandparents had faced: give in to the new threat or try to resist alone. Most gave in, while the few who resisted became the base of the resistance. The Force Awakens confirms that a full generation had passed since the original Death Star's end. The galaxy had rebuilt, and peace had seemed secure. Then another superweapon erased another peaceful system, and the galaxy proved just as unprepared as before. This was not the first time hope had been destroyed in this way. Centuries before these events, another symbol of hope had fallen during the High Republic era. Starlight Beacon represented everything the Republic hoped to become. In the High Republic novels and comics, the station served as a huge relief hub, sending aid to worlds in crisis. It stood as a symbol of what the Jedi and the Republic could do together, floating at the edge of known space as a sign of hope on the frontier. Nihil understood exactly what ending Starlight Beacon would mean. They used the chaos of hyperspace problems to sneak into the station, then brought it down while the entire galaxy watched. As a result, Jedi and Republic workers lost their lives, resources and ships were lost, and peace efforts that had taken years to build fell apart overnight. At the same time, the mental damage proved even greater than the physical losses. High Republic sources show that faith in growth fell apart across the frontier. Worlds that had seemed safe realized that safety had been a lie, and systems began to question whether Republic presence made them targets rather than partners. Jedi trust suffered as well because the Order had shown Starlight Beacon as proof of their commitment to peace and service. Its end suggested that the Jedi could not protect even their most visible project. This event marked a turning point in High Republic history. Before Starlight, the era was defined by growth and hope for the future. After Starlight, fear and defensive thinking took over. The Nihil had ended belief in what the Republic stood for. Remarkably, the Nihil were not even the worst danger of this age. The Nihil were not the first threat to come from hyperspace during this era. The Great Hyperspace Disaster made the entire galaxy question whether faster-than-light travel was safe. According to the High Republic novel Light of the Jedi, hyperspace travel had worked safely for thousands of years. Ships entered hyperspace, traveled faster than light, and came out at their destinations without trouble. The technology was understood. The routes were mapped, and everyone trusted that the system worked. Then the Great Hyperspace Disaster ended that trust completely. It began when a large transport vessel called the Legacy Run was lost while traveling through hyperspace. Normally, the loss of a ship in hyperspace would be a contained tragedy. However, when the Legacy Run broke apart, something never seen before happened. Pieces of the lost ship came out of hyperspace at extreme speed and became weapons no one could predict or stop. The novel describes these events as emergences. Broken parts appeared without warning across a vast region of space at near light speed. They could not be tracked before they arrived or stopped once they appeared. Whatever they hit was gone right away. Soon after, planets were hit without warning while space stations were lost. Trade routes that had operated safely for centuries became deadly dangerous. No one knew where the next emergence would occur or when, because the broken parts could appear anywhere along the path that the Legacy Run had traveled. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy questioned whether hyperspace itself was safe. Because of this, trade routes were left empty, and business between systems slowed down badly. Worlds that depended on space shipping found themselves cut off from supplies that they needed. The vast network of hyperspace lanes that made galactic life possible suddenly seemed weak and unreliable. What made this disaster especially frightening was that it was not a weapon. No enemy had planned it, and no villain had meant for it to happen. A weapon can be found and ended, and an enemy can be spotted and defeated. An accident, on the other hand, can happen again at any time without warning, without cause, and without any way to prevent it. High Republic sources confirm this disaster prove that systems the entire galaxy depended upon could fail badly without any warning at all. Now, the remaining entries come from legend stories, and the first shows that weapons built to end wars can become the war's greatest crime. The mass shadow generator ended the Mandalorian Wars by destroying both sides at once. In the game Knights of the Old Republic 2, the weapon was designed to end a conflict that had dragged on for years. By that point, Republic forces had suffered defeat after defeat, and world after world had fallen to Mandalorian conquest. Republic leadership was desperate for any advantage, and the weapon at Malachor 5 promised to end the war in a single battle. The mass shadow generator controlled gravity on a planetary scale. When turned on, it would create gravity forces strong enough to crush anything in range. Ships, soldiers, vehicles, and buildings would all be gone because nothing could survive what the weapon would create. Then Republic Command turned on the weapon during the peak of battle, when both the Mandalorian and Republic fleets filled the space above Malachor 5 while both armies covered the surface below. The trap was set. When the weapon activated, there was no way to escape. The game depicts ships collapsing in orbit as gravity grew beyond any survivable level. Entire fleets crumpled with their hulls crushed like thin metal. On the surface, both armies were pressed into the ground. Mandalorians and Republic soldiers alike were gone together. Their battle ended in shared loss. The Mandalorian Wars ended with that battle, and the Mandalorian threat was broken. However, victory meant nothing to those who had fallen, and those who survived found that survival carried its own cost. Those who lived through Malachor 5 carried deep wounds that never healed. In the years that followed, survivors went through heavy mental pain after witnessing warfare without limits. Victory had required the Republic to lose its own forces along with the enemy, and many survivors could not accept what they had been part of. Some turned to the dark side, seeking power to ensure they would never be so helpless again, while others simply broke under the weight of what they had seen. Legend sources often name Malachor 5 as proof that total war makes victory meaningless. The Republic won the battle and the war. But the Republic that came out was not the same group that had entered the conflict. In the same way, the Jedi who survived were not the same Jedi who had once sworn to protect all life. As terrible as this was, another weapon caused even stranger damage. The mass shadow generator turned gravity into a weapon. The next disaster turned the Force itself into a weapon. The thought bomb was unlike any other weapon ever created. As described in the Darth Bane novel trilogy, the Sith created this weapon to turn the Force into a tool of harm. The goal was not to channel the Force or direct it towards a target, but rather to make the energy that connected all living things into a bomb. To create this weapon required huge amounts of dark side power. Multiple Sith Lords had to channel their hatred and rage together while feeding the bomb until it reached full power. When finally set off, the thought bomb would end every Force-sensitive being within its range. The weapon made no difference between Sith and Jedi. It would take both equally. According to the trilogy, the blast erased everyone present who could touch the Force. Sith Lords who had spent decades gathering power vanished alongside the Jedi who would come to stop them. Centuries of learning, training, and tradition disappeared in a single moment. When the blast ended, the battlefield fell completely silent. That silence was not peace because the thought bomb had left damage that would not heal. The blast site remained wounded for generations. In the aftermath, legend sources describe a scar in the Force staying at the spot where the thought bomb had gone off. Force users who came near the site felt pain, confusion, and darkness pressing against their minds because the bomb had damaged reality itself by creating a wound that refused to close. After the event, knowledge of the thought bomb method was hidden on purpose. Sith who survived the era refused to teach it to their students, and Jedi who learned of its existence worked to ensure the information was lost. For perhaps the only time in history, both sides of the Force agreed completely that some weapons should never be used again. Yet even this was not the worst thing ever done to the Force. The thought bomb damaged the Force in one spot. The next disaster erased the Force from an entire world. Nathema is the only world in the galaxy where the Force was completely erased from existence. The Old Republic game and related materials depict Nathema as once a living world with cities, nature, and millions of beings. The Force flowed through it just as it flowed through every other world in the galaxy. Then, the Sith Emperor performed his ritual. This ritual required sacrifice on a scale never tried before or since. The Sith Emperor gathered his followers and drew upon their power while channeling everything they had towards a single goal, his own continued life. However, the ritual demanded far more than his followers could provide. It demanded everything on the planet. The ritual drained all life and all Force presence at the same time. According to legend sources, every living thing on Nathema was emptied. Plants, animals, and people were all consumed. The Force itself was stripped completely away, leaving an empty space where energy should have existed. As a result, Nathema became a place where the Force simply did not exist. Force users who came near the planet grew weak. In the game, the closer a Force user came to Nathema, the more their connection to the Force faded and failed. On the surface, that connection vanished entirely. Jedi and Sith alike became ordinary beings unable to touch the power that had defined their entire lives. Even now, the planet cannot recover from what had been done. Life cannot return because seeds planted in the soil will not grow, and animals brought to the surface cannot survive. The conditions required for life had been permanently consumed. To this day, legend sources confirm that even other Sith viewed Nathema as wrong on a deep level. The planet had not ended in any normal sense. It had been unmade, and life itself had been erased from that world. All of these disasters were terrible, but none of them compare to what comes next. Every disaster on this list caused millions or billions of losses. The final entry caused trillions. The Yuuzhan Vong War was fought against an enemy the galaxy had never seen before. As told in the New Jedi Order novel series, the Yuuzhan Vong were a species from outside the known galaxy with technology, biology, and beliefs unlike anything ever seen. Their ships were grown from living tissue rather than built from metal. Their weapons were creatures bred for war rather than machines. Their culture worshipped pain and sacrifice in ways that made peaceful talks impossible. Most importantly, the series makes clear that the Yuuzhan Vong were completely invisible to the Force. Jedi could not sense them coming, could not predict their movements, and could not read their intentions. The abilities that had made Jedi effective for thousands of generations offered nothing against this enemy. For the first time in recorded history, the Force could not help. The war lasted for years, and total losses reached into the trillions. In fact, legend sources confirm the scale of harm went beyond anything ever seen in all of recorded history. Entire worlds were consumed by the invasion, while populations numbering in the billions were lost. Cities that had stood for ages became rubble, shipyards, space stations, and communication systems were targeted and ended one by one. Even worse, planets that resisted the Yuuzhan Vong were not simply conquered. According to the series, these worlds were changed into something alien as native life was consumed, while strange structures grew from living material that had once been buildings and cities. Galactic governments collapsed and reformed multiple times during the war. As a result, the New Republic fell because its government could not put together the response that an invasion of this scale required. Replacement governments rose to take its place and tried to organize resistance, but they eventually fell as well. Alliances formed between former enemies, broke apart under the pressure of constant defeat, and reformed in new ways. Nothing remained stable because stability was impossible. At the same time, legend sources describe the Yuuzhan Vong adapting to every plan developed against them. When resistance grew strong in one area, they simply attacked somewhere else. The war ground forward year after year, consuming resources and ending populations. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing except war. During this time, children were born after the invasion had already begun, and they learned about loss before they understood what peace meant. Fear was a constant companion throughout their childhoods. By the time the war finally ended, these children had become adults who carried the conflict inside them. They could not picture a galaxy without enemies because they had never known one. The series confirms this war stands as the single greatest lasting disaster in all of galactic history. The effects lasted long after the fighting stopped. In the end, survivors carried memories of loss that shaped every decision they made afterward. Trust between peoples and governments became difficult. Groups that rebuilt after the war did so around the idea that another invasion could come at any time. The galaxy that came out of the Yuuzhan Vong War was harder, more watchful, and more heavily armed than the galaxy that had existed before. No other event in canon or legends comes close to this level of destruction. The Yuuzhan Vong War stands alone as the moment when the galaxy came closest to complete end and barely survived. From these tragedies, a clear pattern emerges. The galaxy does not fall because of villains alone, but because multiple systems fail at once. Trust breaks down, key systems collapse, and belief in shared values shatters. Yet the Star Wars galaxy endures. Empires rise and eventually fall, while republics collapse and later reform. The Jedi vanish and then return. Through every disaster, some thread of life survives, and some base remains upon which the next generation can rebuild. However, lasting is not the same as healing, and survival is not the same as getting back what was lost. The galaxy that exists after a disaster is never quite the same as the galaxy that existed before. These 12 events left marks that time alone could not erase.
Those disasters scarred entire worlds, and yet most of that damage faded with time or was slowly rebuilt. One planet never got that chance. Its surface has burned without pause for thousands of years, and nature had nothing to do with it. Mustafar should not exist in the form we know it today. The lava, the endless eruptions, the surface that never cools, and none of it should be physically possible, and the reason it is has nothing to do with geology. Most people remember Mustafar as the place where Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, but that moment was only a footnote in a much older and much darker story, because long before Vader ever set foot on this world, the Sith had already claimed it, not just as a stronghold, but as a secret they were determined to keep buried. They found something here, something that gave them power they could not afford to lose, and when they discovered that the damage could be undone, they made a deliberate choice to make sure it never would be. After going through both canon and legend sources, a much darker truth emerges, one that reframes everything we think we know about this planet. The Sith didn't just use Mustafar, they kept it broken on purpose. This is the full story of why. Chapter 1. A planet that shouldn't exist. Mustafar sits locked between two massive gas giants, and the gravitational pull from both subjects the planet to a process called tidal forcing. Competing gravitational fields constantly flex and compress the planetary body from the outside in, generating enormous internal friction. You can see a milder version of this on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, the most volcanically active body in our own solar system, for exactly this reason. But what Io experiences and what Mustafar experiences are not the same thing. In any tidally stressed world, the energy cycles eventually find equilibrium. Material erupts, cools, resettles, and the internal pressure redistributes. Mustafar has never done this. Every simulation ever run on the planet's behavior reaches the same conclusion. The geological forces at work should have either torn the planet apart or burned themselves out long before the events of the Clone Wars. The volcanic activity is not just intense, it is constant, self-perpetuating, and operating at a sustained maximum that defies every model of natural planetary behavior. The planet should be dead. Instead, it rages. Something is feeding it deliberately. The Jedi avoided Mustafar almost entirely during the height of the Republic. The dark side saturation made it hostile territory, a place where your connection to the Force worked against you, amplifying doubt and fear in ways that could fracture even the most disciplined composure. Most historical accounts simply note that the planet was volcanic and leave it there. That explanation was never the whole story. The volcanic activity was a symptom, not a cause, and no one who accepted it as the answer ever asked why it hadn't burned itself out. The answer lies far in the past, in a time when Mustafar looked nothing like the world that forged Darth Vader. Back when it had water and forests and open skies, and back to the moment one person's grief ended all of that and left behind something that the Sith would spend centuries learning how to use. Chapter 2. The World That Was Lost. Beneath Mustafar's lava-covered surface, the evidence of a completely different world is still there if you know where to look. Deep geological scans have revealed fossilized forests buried under layers of volcanic rock, their root systems still intact, stretching across regions that are now nothing but scorched plains and rivers of molten stone. In other areas, scientists have uncovered dried basins that were once inland seas, complete with the calcified remains of aquatic species that could not survive in extreme heat. The biological record is unambiguous. This planet supported a complex, thriving ecosystem at some point in the relatively recent past. The native Mustafarians have always shown this. Their oldest oral traditions speak of a time called the Bright Star, an era when their world was filled with water, with open skies not yet choked by ash, with vegetations and light and the kind of stability that lets a culture build and remember across generations. For a long time, the wider galaxy dismissed these stories as mythology. The geological record proves they were not. The bright star was real, and the person who ended it wasn't a conqueror. She was someone trying to save the person she loved. Her name was Lady Korvax. She was force-sensitive, powerful, and consumed entirely by grief. Her husband had died, and she refused to accept that death as final. That impulse is not unique in the history of the Force. The desire to reach past death, to undo loss, to recover what was taken, it appears again and again in the stories of those who interact with the Force at the deepest levels. What made Korvax different was not the grief itself, it was what she found to act on it. The Aeon engine was an ancient piece of Force-based technology, unlike anything else documented in galactic history. Its precise origins are unclear, but its function was extraordinary. The device could interface directly with the life energy of an entire planetary body, not the Force connection of individual beings, but the accumulated biological and spiritual energy of a whole world, its ecosystems, its creatures, the resonance built up over centuries of organic life existing in relationship with a place. She believed she could use it to reach past death. What she didn't know was what the attempt would cost everyone else. Korvax believed she could draw on that energy and redirect it towards something the Force had taken from her. If the device could tap into the full life resonance of a living planet, perhaps the boundary between life and death could be weakened enough to pull someone back through it. This is the same reasoning that would draw Vader to Mustafar thousands of years later. It is the same logic Palpatine used when he whispered to Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis. The desire to reverse death through Force-based intervention is not an invention of the dark side. It is something close to a universal impulse, and the dark side has always known how to use it. Korvax was not a Sith. She was someone in agony who found a tool that seemed to offer a way through that agony and used it without fully understanding what she was holding. The horror of what happened to Mustafar is not that it was done by a monster, it is that it was done by someone who loved deeply, reached too far, and left an entire world paying the price for that reach. The attempt failed catastrophically. Instead of drawing energy outward, the Aeon engine destabilized and turned inward. It began consuming the planet rather than channeling it, pulling thermal, biological, and Force energy simultaneously into an accelerating feedback loop. The planet's core ignited. Tectonic systems that had been stable for millennia fractured in sequence. Oceans evaporated, forests burned to nothing in hours. The bright star didn't fade, it was extinguished in hours, and the damage didn't stop when the fires did. The atmosphere, once clear enough for open skies, thickened into toxic ash that would not clear for thousands of years. The bright star that the Mustafarians' ancestors had known, the open skies, the water, the living world, was gone in the span of a single catastrophe. Korvax had not saved her husband. She had destroyed an entire world in the attempt, and she had done it alone. Every living thing that died in the transformation fed that wound and made it deeper. Mustafar was not simply destroyed, it became something else entirely. And that something else was exactly what the Sith had been looking for. Chapter 3: The Korvax Catastrophe. The Sith did not stumble onto Mustafar, they were drawn to it. A wound in the Force of the scale created by the Korvax catastrophe does not go unnoticed by beings who spend their lives attuned to dark side energy. The versions that formed at the side of the Aeon engine's failure was not a subtle disturbance, it was a concentrated rupture. A place where the membrane between the physical world and the Force had been torn thin by the violent death of an entire biosphere. For a Jedi, this would register as a place to avoid. For the Sith, it registered as something they had never found before, a natural amplifier, a source of raw dark side power that required no construction, no ritual, no maintenance. Vergences exist throughout the galaxy. The cave beneath the ancient tree on Dagobah is one. The wellspring beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant is another. Most of them form gradually, the accumulated resonance of significant events or of Force-sensitive beings spending centuries in a single location. The Mustafar Vergence was different in kind. It did not accumulate gradually. It was created in an instant, in a catastrophic discharge of Force energy that left the site permanently saturated with dark power. That origin gave it qualities that could not be replicated artificially: raw volatility, extreme concentration, and a sustained instability that made dark side techniques feel effortless in a way they did not anywhere else in the galaxy. Rituals conducted there were stronger. Artifacts stored there absorbed and held dark side charge in ways that artifacts elsewhere simply could not. The planet functioned as an amplification system, and the Sith moved quickly to claim it. Artifacts of immense power were transported there and buried beneath the surface, where the Vergence would preserve and strengthen them indefinitely. Experiments were conducted in the volcanic depths, explorations of dark side capability that required the kind of energy concentration only Mustafar could provide. Texts and techniques and histories that the Sith considered too volatile to risk in locations the Jedi might find were encoded and stored there. For generations, the arrangement held. The Sith grew stronger. Their artifacts deepened in charge. Their rituals reached levels of power that would have been impossible anywhere else, and the Mustafarians, adapted to their volcanic world and unaware of what lay beneath their feet, continued to survive inside a catastrophe that someone else had decided was too useful to end. It was, by any measure, a perfect arrangement, which is exactly why the Sith spent so much effort making sure it can never change. For the Sith, it was nearly perfect, nearly because the power they were drawing on was not a stable resource. Every dark side tradition understood, at some level, that Vergences were not permanent features of a landscape. They were concentrations of Force energy that had accumulated under specific conditions. Change those conditions, and the Vergence changed with them. Mustafar's Vergence was sustained by the Aeon Engine's ongoing disruption of the planet's Force resonance, a disruption that the planet's own natural processes would eventually work to correct, the same way any wound, left alone, eventually begins to close. The Sith were sophisticated enough to understand this, and that understanding forced them towards the most consequential decision they would ever make on Mustafar. The Vergence was only this powerful because the wound was still open. A heal Mustafar, a world where the Aeon Engine's damage had been reversed, where the ecosystems had recovered, and the Force resonance had returned to something balanced, would not have generated this kind of dark side energy. The power came from the ongoing rupture. It came from the sustained, unresolved catastrophe. Sith philosophy has always held that strength justifies its own exercise. On Mustafar, that philosophy reached one of its most extreme conclusions. It is worth pausing on the full weight of that. The Sith were not ignorant of what Mustafar had been. The geological and Force-based evidence of a once-living world was not hidden from them. They were among the most thorough researchers of planetary history in the galaxy. They knew the Mustafarians had survived. They knew an entire culture had adapted to conditions that should never have been permanent. They knew, when they found the Aeon Engine, that there was a path back to what the planet had been. And they made a decision, not out of ignorance, not out of necessity, but out of calculation. Chapter 4. Why the Sith chose Mustafar. At some point during their occupation of Mustafar, the Sith made a discovery that should have changed the planet's fate. The Aeon Engine was still there, buried beneath the volcanic surface, damaged but intact. The device that had caused the catastrophe had survived it. Sith scholars and archaeologists eventually located it and assessed its condition, and what they found would have been extraordinarily good news to anyone who did not have a vested interest in keeping Mustafar broken. The damage was not permanent. The Aeon Engine could be repaired. The engineering required was not simple, and the process would have demanded significant time and resources, but it was achievable. More importantly, a repaired engine would not simply stop draining the planet. Because of the way the device interfaced with planetary life force, a functional Aeon Engine running in its intended mode would actively reverse the damage it had caused. The volcanic activity would subside as the tectonic system stabilized. The dark side virgins, sustained entirely by the ongoing rupture, would dissipate as the wound in the Force began to close. Given enough time, the ecosystems could return. The planet could breathe again. Mustafar could be restored to what it had been before Korvax activated the engine. The Sith did not repair it, and that single decision condemned an entire world to thousands more years of destruction. A living Mustafar would have been worthless to them. The entire basis of the planet's value as a stronghold was the Virgins, and the Virgins existed because the wound existed. Restoring the planet would have eliminated the very thing that made it useful. So instead, they did something methodical and deliberate. They made sure the wound could never close. There is a distinction here that matters. The Sith did not cause what happened to Mustafar. Korvax caused it, alone, driven by grief, and by a technology she did not fully understand. The Sith bore no responsibility for the original catastrophe. What they are responsible for is every decision they made after the moment they understood what the Aeon engine represented and chose to leave it buried. The original destruction was an accident. What followed was a policy. For thousands of years, every Sith presence on Mustafar operated under a system deliberately designed to prevent the planet from ever recovering. Every ritual conducted there, every artifact stored there, every piece of dark side knowledge encoded and hidden in the volcanic depths, all of it ran on power that depended on a wound staying open that the Sith had specifically chosen to keep that way. Sith artifacts known as dark side totems were placed at calculated positions across the planet's surface. These were not decorative markers, they were functional anchors, devices engineered specifically to channel dark side energy into the planet's wound and reinforce the conditions maintaining it. Each totem held a corruption in place, suppressed the natural processes that would otherwise have begun drawing the rupture closed, and ensured that the volcanic activity and dark side saturation remained at the intensity the Sith required. The system was not passive. It required ongoing maintenance and intent. The Sith were not simply exploiting a damaged world, they were actively managing its damage, day after day, century after century, to make sure it never healed. The implications, spelled out plainly, were difficult to ignore. They looked at an entire civilization living inside ongoing destruction and decided that destruction was more valuable than the people suffering through it. The Mustafarians kept their oral traditions alive through all of it. They maintained the memory of the bright star and told their children about a green world that existed before the burning, a world they had no reason to expect would ever return. And all of that time, buried beneath the surface of their home, was a device that could have ended their suffering, surrounded by a network of Sith artifacts specifically designed to make sure it never would. That was the dark truth the Sith buried on Mustafar, and Vader would soon arrive to push it further than anyone before him had dared. Chapter 5: Vader's Fortress. Darth Vader chose Mustafar not as a monument to his past, and not as a symbol of his fall. He chose it as a tool, a mechanism he believed could do something no other location in the galaxy was capable of doing. He wanted to use the wound in the Force to reach through death itself. The full story of how the fortress was built is documented in the Darth Vader comic series by Charles Soule. It begins with a spirit named Momin, an ancient Sith Lord whose consciousness had been preserved in a mask that Darth Sidious gave to Vader. Momin had spent centuries trapped in the object, waiting for a host and a purpose. Vader provided both. His expertise was architecture as a Force instrument. He understood, at a level no one else had mapped, how physical structures could be designed to channel, concentrate, and direct Force energy. Vader gave him Mustafar, the most powerful dark-side virgins in the known galaxy, and a single directive: build something that could open a door between the living world and the dead one. The construction took years. Early versions of the fortress had failed repeatedly, each collapse caused by the structure's inability to handle the volume of dark-side energy rising from the virgins below. Mustafarian workers died in the backlash. Momin kept iterating, each failure feeding information back into the next attempt. What eventually emerged was not a castle in any conventional sense. Every element of its architecture served the same function: The towers were positioned not for aesthetics, but to catch and redirect the dark side energy rising from the planet's wound. The angles of the walls, the depth of the foundation shafts, the geometry of the internal chambers, all of it was engineered to draw the virgins upward from beneath the surface, concentrate it through the structure, and focus it into a single point deep in the complex. The whole building was a lens. The virgins was the light it was focusing. Vader had not built a home on Mustafar, he had built a machine designed to break the boundary between life and death. His fall to the dark side had been built entirely around the fear of losing Padme, and everything Palpatine had told him about the dark side's power over death had been aimed at exactly that fear. Vader had lived for years knowing the promise was hollow, that Padme had died, that the dark side had not saved her, that everything he had destroyed had been destroyed for nothing. The fortress was his attempt to prove that the power was real after all, not to undo what had happened, but to reach her, to find whatever remained of her on the other side of death and make some form of contact with it. Two people, separated by thousands of years, both driven to the same world by the same grief. Korvax and Vader, both attempting to use the same wound in the Force to reach past death to someone they had lost. Korvax used the Aeon engine and destroyed a world in the attempt. Vader used a fortress designed by a Sith spirit and failed more quietly, withdrawing from the threshold with whatever he had encountered on the other side, locked away in a silence he never broke. The dark side could pull at the boundary between life and death and make it temporarily thin, but it could not do what either of them needed it to do. The wound in the Force is not a door. It cannot be made into one, no matter how precisely the architecture is designed or how much power is concentrated through it. And what the fortress reveals, across the whole arc of Mustafar's history, is the logical endpoint of everything the Sith had been building toward since they first set foot on this planet. They found a wound and chose to keep it open. They built a system to hold that wound against the natural forces that would have closed it. Their greatest lord then built a machine directly over that wound and tried to reach through it into death. Each step follows from the last, each a more extreme version of the same impulse, the belief that the dark side's power over suffering is the same as power over the Force. The fortress is that philosophy made physical, and like the philosophy, it reached its absolute limit the moment it was pushed furthest. The ritual was activated. The energy of the Virgin surged through the fortress at full intensity. For a moment, and the comics render this with a quiet devastation the films never matched, the barrier between the living Force and what lies beyond it began to thin, and Vader stepped through. He reached something. He experienced something on the other side that the comic leaves deliberately ambiguous, whether it was Padme, a shadow of her, something darker wearing her shape, or simply the confirmation that the boundary could not be crossed. But it did not work. The attempt collapsed. Vader withdrew. The fortress stood intact, its architecture still fully functional, its purpose now permanently unrealized. He never came back to try again. A man who had destroyed everything in pursuit of a single promise had pushed that promise as far back as it could go, in the one place in the galaxy most designed to make it possible, and come back alone. The dark side had not lied to him about the power. It had simply never told him what the power could not do. Chapter 6. The Secret the Sith Hid. The Sith found the Aeon engine and made a choice that most accounts of this planet never fully reckon with. They did not destroy it, did not fear it, did not hide it out of ignorance. They assessed it with full knowledge of what it was, concluded that a repaired engine would cost them everything they had built on this planet, and decided to ensure it can never be used again. But every system built on suppression has a breaking point, and when the Sith finally fell, Mustafar would begin doing something no one alive had ever seen it do, something that proved everything the Sith had built here was never as permanent as they believed. That story is next. Chapter 7. A Planet Beginning to Heal. With the fall of the Sith, the system they had spent centuries building to keep Mustafar broken began to come apart. The dark side totems anchored across the planet's surface were not passive structures. They required the active current of Sith practice and intent flowing through them to hold the wound open. When the Sith fell, when Sidious died at Exegol and the order he had maintained collapsed, that current broke. The totems began to fail, not immediately since these were ancient structures with deep roots in the planet's geology and force resonance, but progressively. One anchor point weakened, then another. Then, the system as a whole began to lose the coherence that had made it effective for so long. No one directed this. No one activated anything. The structures the Sith had built simply stopped receiving what they needed to function, and without them, Mustafar was left alone with its own nature for the first time in millennia. And for the first time in thousands of years, the planet began to answer. And as the artificial system failed, the natural one began to reassert itself. The volcanic cycles that had been sustained at maximum intensity by the anchored wound started to moderate. Lava flows that had been continuous for as long as anyone alive could remember began to slow and cool in sections, leaving solid ground where there had been none. The atmosphere, choked for millennia with volcanic particulate and dark side resonance, began to thin in certain regions. Not dramatically, not uniformly across the whole planet, but measurably. And then, in areas where the lava had cooled long enough for stable ground to form, and where the atmosphere had shifted enough to allow for something other than ash, plant life began to appear. Mosses first, then ground cover, small and isolated at first, the kind of pioneer organisms that colonize newly stable ground before anything more complex can follow. But present, alive, on a world that had not supported visible plant life in thousands of years. This was not just recovery, this was proof that everything the Sith had built on Mustafar had been a lie. If Mustafar's condition had been the result of natural forces, the tidal compression from the gas giants, the instability of its orbital position, then the fall of the Sith would have changed nothing. The planet would have kept burning regardless of what happened to its most recent occupants, because natural forces do not respond to political events. The gravitational relationship between Mustafar and the gas giants on either side of it was not affected by Sidious dying at Exegol, but Mustafar began to heal the moment the Sith-built system maintaining its destruction failed. That is not a coincidence, that is causation. The wound was artificial, the maintenance was real, and without the maintenance, the planet began to do what it would have done centuries earlier if the Sith had not intervened. It started recovering. The Mustafarians noticed. Their oral traditions, which had carried the memory of the bright star across thousands of years of volcanic darkness, began to take on a different quality. Not just memory of what had been lost, but something closer to anticipation. The elders who maintained the stories of the Green World for generations they had no reason to believe would see any change began to speak differently about what might still be possible. For the first time in thousands of years, the bright star was not just a memory, it was beginning to look like a direction. Whether that recovery will ever reach the scale of what Mustafar was before the Korvac's catastrophe is a question that remains genuinely open. The Aeon engine is still buried somewhere beneath the surface. Whether anyone will ever locate it, repair it, and use it as Korvax intended, to restore rather than drain, is not answered by current canon. But the direction has changed, and the reason it changed tells you everything you need to know about what the Sith actually were on this planet. They found a world that someone else had broken by accident. They found a device that could have fixed it, chose to leave it buried, and spent centuries actively suppressing any chance of recovery because a broken Mustafar made them stronger than a living one ever could. They built totems to hold the wound open. They raised a fortress over it and tried to reach through it into death. They kept an entire people living inside destruction that existed only because their suffering was useful. The Mustafarians told their children about the bright star for thousands of years, never knowing that the reason it could not return was because someone had made sure it wouldn't. The Sith were wrong about a great many things, but the most consequential thing they were wrong about was this: that wounds held open by Force stay open forever. They don't. The moment the Force holding Mustafar broken was removed, the planet began to prove it. The Force does not remain broken forever, not because of some abstract guarantee, but because the structures that hold wounds open are mortal. They depend on the beings who built them remaining in power, remaining committed to a philosophy of extraction that eventually consumes the people practicing it as thoroughly as it consumes everything around them. The Sith built their power on a wound in the Force. When they were gone, the wound began to close, and Mustafar, slowly, imperfectly, and against all the odds of its own history, began to remember what it had been. The bright star that the Mustafarians had kept alive in history for thousands of years was not just a memory of the past, it was, finally, a description of what was coming. The Sith kept one world frozen in ruin for thousands of years, but a planet was not the only thing they left stranded in time. One of their own commanders sealed himself away on purpose, and unlike Mustafar, nothing ever came to wake him. He slept straight through the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, and every Sith who came after, and he may be sleeping still. Darth Glovoc was one of the most feared commanders in Revan's Sith Empire, a military mind the Order valued, a Sith the Order kept at arm's length, and a man whose victories on the battlefield were matched only by the reputation for instability that followed him everywhere. He was responsible for several highly successful campaigns against the Galactic Republic during the Jedi Civil War. He was valued and feared. In an order built on strength and ruthlessness, that meant something. But Glovoc was not like the other Sith commanders, where most of his peers spent their off hours sharpening blades or consolidating power. Glovoc disappeared into meditation. He was brilliant, but also believed to be somewhat insane, a reputation he did nothing to discourage. He spent the majority of his free time in deep meditative states, not the careful, controlled meditation of a Jedi trying to quiet the mind, but a plunging, searching kind of focus that pushed outward through the Force, seeking something he couldn't quite name. He called this practice his true work. He called himself, with complete seriousness, the Lord of the Mind's Eye. Other Sith thought he was unhinged. They tolerated him because of his results on the battlefield, but they kept their distance. A commander who spent more time in trance than in briefings made people uncomfortable, and in an empire built on domination and calculated cruelty, discomfort was enough to mark someone as a liability. Yet Glovoc didn't care. He had a short temper and absolute faith in his visions, a combination that made him dangerous to argue with. He was known to execute subordinates who contradicted his interpretation of what the Force was showing him, and when pushed far enough, he could subject a person to a slow and agonizing death. He was not a Sith Lord who inspired loyalty through charisma. He inspired it through fear and through the undeniable fact that his campaigns worked. What he was actually searching for in all those hours of meditation was the key to the Sith's ultimate victory over the Republic and the Jedi. That was the goal he had given himself. Not just battlefield success, but some deeper answer, some insight the dark side might deliver if he was patient enough and willing to push far enough into the void between thoughts. He believed the Force was trying to show him something, and that if he listened long enough, it would. For years, it didn't. He kept fighting, kept winning, kept meditating while the war ground on. Then, near the closing years of the Jedi Civil War, under Darth Malik's rule, Darth Glovoc finally got his answer. It came in a dream, and when he woke from it, everything he had spent years fighting for suddenly meant nothing compared to what it was showing him. Chapter 2. The Vision. Inside his mind, in the deep place he had spent years trying to reach, Glovoc saw a world. It was dark, not the comfortable darkness of deep space, but a churning, living darkness. The planet was wrapped entirely in thick, layered cloud, the kind that made the surface invisible from orbit. Through those clouds, violet lightning tore in long, jagged bolts, like dark energy made visible. The whole world pulsed with a strange electricity. He couldn't see what was on the surface. He couldn't see what was down there, but something in the vision reached him in a way years of meditation had not. The Force was not whispering this time. It was pointing. Glovoc woke up absolutely certain that that's what he had been looking for, and that he had to find it immediately. What exactly he believed the planet held is not spelled out in the source material. The vision filled him with an overwhelming desire to investigate. He was sure the dark side was telling him something significant was there, and he didn't feel the need to explain himself further to anyone who questioned him. When a subordinate apparently pushed back on his interpretation of the dream, Glovoc's response was the kind that ended conversations. He began searching his records for any system that matched what he had seen. He was looking for a world with permanent cloud cover in a region the Sith hadn't thoroughly explored, a world that had been passed over or ignored because there was no obvious strategic value in cataloging it. After combing through navigation data, he found what he was looking for, the Lure system. Tucked away in the mid-rim, home to a fifth planet that matched his vision almost exactly. Glovoc received his vision during the final months of the Jedi Civil War, at the precise moment when the conflict was approaching its breaking point. Darth Malak was fighting to hold the Sith Empire together. The redeemed Revan, his memories restored, his identity rebuilt by the Jedi, was moving against the Starforge, the ancient Rakatan superweapon that powered the Sith war machine. Everything was in motion. The outcome of the war was no longer certain, and in that moment, Glovoc made a decision that shocked even the people who already thought he was losing his mind. He abandoned the war entirely. He took command of an interdictor-class warship called the Dying Sun and ordered his crew to set course for the Lure system. He left no explanation that the sources record. He simply went. The remaining Sith Empire, which had bigger problems to deal with than tracking down one eccentric commander, took a mild interest in his destination and then moved on. The Sith as a whole registered Glovoc's vision and the Lure system with passing curiosity, nothing more. As the Dying Sun moved through hyperspace toward Nerian, Glovoc slept again. He spent the journey with his mind's eye extended outward, trying to reach the world ahead of him, trying to pierce the cloud cover in his thoughts before his ship arrived in person. He couldn't. Something about the planet resisted his attempts to probe it from a distance. Whatever was down there was not giving itself up easily. That should have been a warning. Chapter 3. The Dying Sun Falls. The Dying Sun arrived at Nerian in 3956 BBY. From orbit, the planet looked exactly like Glovoc's dream. Thick, churning clouds covered every surface of the world below, and purple lightning cracked through the layers in long, brilliant flashes. The crew ran active scans. They needed to understand what they were looking at before anyone descended. That decision cost them. The active sensors were powerful enough to do their job, and powerful enough to be detected. Glovoc was so focused on Nerian, so deep in his attempt to read the planet, that he didn't sense the Republic vessels approaching until it was already too late. He had come all this way chasing a vision, and in the moment of arrival, his obsession with the planet below became the thing that blinded him to the threat beside him. A Republic strike force had stumbled into the Lure system, and when they found a Sith interdictor-class warship sitting in orbit over an uncharted planet, they didn't ask questions. The battle that followed was brief and violent. The Dying Sun's crew was Sith-trained, and they fought hard. They managed to destroy 3 Republic cruisers and a significant number of Republic starfighters before the tide turned. But 3 cruisers were not enough. The Republic forces kept pressing, and the Dying Sun was taking hits it couldn't absorb. Torpedoes struck critical systems. The warship that had carried Glovoc across the galaxy in search of his vision began to come apart. Caught in Nerian's gravity well, the Dying Sun couldn't escape. Its orbit decayed. It broke into pieces as it fell, sections of the hull separating as the atmosphere tore at the damaged frame, and what remained hit the surface in a crash that any surviving crew member was lucky to walk away from. Escape pods from both sides rained down alongside the debris. None of them was ever heard from again. The Republic forces, having dealt what they calculated as a killing blow to an enemy warship in a remote system, recorded the engagement and moved on. They never stopped to ask why a Sith commander had been orbiting an unremarkable mid-rim planet in the first place. The Republic simply assumed the Dying Sun had been hiding, avoiding discovery in a quiet corner of space. They didn't know what they had stumbled into, and they never went back to find out. On the surface of Nerian, among the scattered wreckage and the survivors who had made it through the crash, Darth Glovoc was still alive. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. The crash of the Dying Sun should not have left many people standing, but Glovoc was standing, and a handful of his crew were with him, and the planet that had called to him from the other side of a dream was now all around them. It was everything the vision had shown. The cloud cover so thick that nothing in the sky was visible, the lightning cracking constantly through layers of storm, the air heavy and electric in a way that made the Force behave strangely. When Glovoc attempted to reach outward through the Force, to sense the planet the way he had tried to from orbit, he found the same wall he had encountered on the voyage over. His mental probes couldn't breach the cloud layer. Whatever the interference was, whether it came from the atmosphere itself, from something in the ionosphere, from the magnetic field that drove the endless storms, It cut off Force perception in both directions. A Force user on the surface could not sense space, and a Force user in space could not sense anything below. The dark side had led him here, and here, the dark side couldn't fully reach him. Chapter 4. Stranded. What Glovoc did next defined what kind of leader he actually was beneath the meditation and the visions. He organized the survivors, however many of his crew had made it through the crash and the escape pods, pulling them together under his authority. He turned them toward the problem of staying alive on a planet none of them had ever intended to land on. He was described during this period as a harsh but effective leader. The same qualities that had made him successful on the battlefield now directed towards survival instead of conquest. Nerian was not a welcoming world. The tempests were constant, with storms of varying intensity cycling across the surface throughout the year. The lightning made open ground dangerous. The cloud cover blocked any reliable view of the stars, which meant the disorientation of an unfamiliar world was compounded by the inability to navigate by the sky. They had the wreckage of the dying sun, whatever equipment had survived, and each other. They also had the dark side, and on the surface, at least, the Force still worked. It just couldn't reach beyond the atmosphere. Over time, Glovoc's people encountered the native inhabitants of Nerian. These interactions were hostile. The Sith survivors preyed on the natives when they could, and the wider population of Nerian learned quickly to avoid the area where Glovoc's group had settled. It was a harsh equilibrium. The Sith were too dangerous to approach, too small a group to threaten the planet as a whole, and too stranded to go anywhere. As time passed, Glovoc continued his meditation. The planet's force-dampening qualities never stopped bothering him. His disciples began to speculate about the source of the interference, and that speculation hardened over the years into something close to belief, a conviction that something within Nerian itself was causing the phenomenon, not the weather, not the physics, but something that lived inside the world, something that had been there long before they arrived. Glovoc never confirmed it. He just kept meditating, kept pushing his perception towards the barrier, and kept failing. It was somewhere in these years, stranded on a planet that resisted his greatest ability, that Darth Glovoc made the decision that would make him the longest surviving Sith in recorded history. He wasn't gonna die on Nerian, not of age, not of attrition, not of the slow, grinding defeat of watching his people dwindle while the galaxy moved on without him. If the Force had brought him here for a reason, he intended to be alive when that reason became clear. He had an oubliette. An oubliette was a Sith stasis casket, an artifact of considerable power and rarity. The only other oubliette documented in the Legends continuity was created by the ancient Sith Lord Remulus Drapa to imprison his rival Carnes Mir, as documented in the Legends Vector crossover comic arc, containing both the Sith Lord and the dangerous influence of the Mir talisman. These devices were not ordinary tools. They required significant knowledge to construct and even more to use safely. The fact that Glovoc possessed one aboard the Dying Sun says something about how seriously the Sith took his abilities, and how prepared he had been for possibilities he couldn't have fully anticipated. Inside the oubliette, a person could be kept alive for thousands of years, not frozen in the conventional sense, not carbonite, not cryostasis, but suspended in a deep, dark side sleep that slowed the body's processes to something close to nothing. It was sleep taken to its ultimate limit. It was the closest thing a mortal being could achieve to stepping outside of time. So he climbed in, and the galaxy moved on without him. Chapter 5. The Sleeping God. At first, he set limits for himself. Glovoc initially restricted his time in stasis to periods of roughly 100 years, long enough to sleep through the slow grind of history, short enough to check on the world he left behind. He would emerge, assess the situation, how many of his people were left, what condition they were in, whether any opportunity for escape from Nerian had presented itself, and then return to the casket and sleep again. One look at the world before going dark once more. What he found each time he emerged is not detailed in the source material, but the pattern of what happened to his followers is. These Sith survivors marooned across generations on a storm-covered planet with no way off, and a culture built around a leader who disappeared for a century at a time began to change. The process was stark. Over the millennia, they became twisted and inbred, their physical forms warping alongside their minds, their understanding of Sith discipline eroding into something more primal. They stopped being Sith warriors. They became something else entirely. The Children of the Tempest. It was the name of people who had been shaped by the storms, who had grown up under an unbroken ceiling of cloud, who had never once in their lives seen a clear sky. They hunted with spears. They howled like animals when they fought, a geologically active area where the ground itself breathed heat, and they performed rituals there that bore only a passing resemblance to anything that could be traced back to Sith doctrine. At the center of it all was the oubliette, the casket where their lord slept. The children called him the Dying Sun, taking the name from the wreckage of the ship that had brought them to this world. They built their reverence around his sleeping form. To them, he was not simply a commander or Dark Lord, he was a god. A deity who had chosen to rest until the right moment, who would one day open his eyes and lead them out of Nerion and into whatever greatness awaited beyond the storms. They sacrificed to him. They protected him with absolute ferocity. Any threat to the oubliette was a threat to the divine, and they responded accordingly. Glovoc, meanwhile, was sleeping more and more. His periods of consciousness grew increasingly infrequent as the centuries passed. Whether this was by design, or simply the casket doing its work, pulling him deeper the longer he stayed, is not recorded. What is clear is that, at some point, he stopped emerging at all. The 100-year intervals gave way to longer silences, and then to no intervals at all. He was in perpetual stasis. The world moved on without him. Centuries became millennia. The Jedi Civil War that had defined his entire career dissolving into ancient history, while the Republic that had shot him down over Nerion was replaced, reformed, shattered, and rebuilt again and again around him. Darth Bane rose and established the rule of two. Hundreds of Sith came and went under that rule, each one part of a dynasty that Glovoc had no knowledge of. The Sith disappeared from public view for 1,000 years. Then came Darth Sidious, the Clone Wars, the rise of the Empire, the destruction of the Death Star, Vader's fall, and Palpatine's death at Endor, and finally the birth of the New Republic. All of it unfolding while Glovoc breathed his slow, impossible breaths inside his casket on a planet nobody was looking for. The only disruption in his perfect unconsciousness came after Nerion was eventually colonized. As the planet began to develop, as more people arrived and settlements grew and the world became less isolated, the disturbance reached Glovoc even in stasis. His sleep became fitful, restless, as if something in the increasing presence of life and activity on the surface was penetrating the deep stillness the casket maintained. His followers tried everything they knew to wake him, pressing their hands to the casket, performing their rituals with greater intensity, calling to him in whatever language the Children of the Tempest had developed over the generations. But nothing worked. He wouldn't stir. Darth Glovoc was past the point where waking up was simple. He had gone too deep. Time had accumulated around him like weight, and pulling him back was not something his deformed descendants could manage on their own. Chapter 6. The One Sith Comes Calling. In 132 ABY, nearly 4,000 years after Darth Glovoc had first sealed himself into the casket, someone finally came looking for him. The galaxy at this point was under Darth Krayt's One Sith, and Krayt was hungry for anything that might strengthen his grip. Artifacts, knowledge, history. Rumors had reached his agents. Whispers about a Sith warship called the Dying Sun, which had vanished during the Jedi Civil War and never been accounted for, and what it might have been carrying when it disappeared. Krayt dispatched one of his Sith lords to investigate. His name was Darth Vurik, and he traveled to Nerion to find whatever the Dying Sun had left behind. What Vurik found when he arrived was not what he expected. He located the Sith settlement without too much difficulty. After 4,000 years, the Children of the Tempest had developed enough of a presence on Nerion that finding them was possible for someone who knew what to look for. But finding them and getting past them were different problems entirely. The deformed descendants of Glovoc's crew did not receive Vurik as a fellow Sith. They received him as a threat to their god. They attacked immediately, and Vurik cut through many of them. The one Sith Lord was powerful, and the Children of the Tempest, however devoted, were not trained warriors. But there were enough of them, and their protectiveness of the casket was absolute. Every step Vurik took towards Glovoc's sleeping form was contested. Then the situation complicated itself further. Other people on Nerion had noticed what was happening, local clan members, and among them a group of fugitive Jedi who had been living on the planet in hiding recognized that a one Sith Lord was attacking a settlement. They moved to intervene. Several of these Jedi confronted Vurik directly. The fight that followed went badly for both sides. Vurik wounded several of the Jedi and killed at least one, but he couldn't hold off both the Children of the Tempest and the Jedi simultaneously, and eventually he was forced to retreat to Locus, Nerion's capital city. While Vurik was occupied with the Jedi, the Children of the Tempest did exactly what they had been born to do. They protected their god, moving with a speed and coordination that surprised people who had only seen them as deformed and primitive. They relocated Glovoc's casket. By the time Vurik had extracted himself from the confrontation and turned back toward the settlement, it was gone, hidden somewhere in Nerion's vast, storm-covered terrain, in a location the children would die before revealing. Vurik was left with nothing. No Glovoc, no holocrons, no artifacts from Revan's era. He had come all this way and had only bodies and failure to show for it, and he couldn't bring himself to report that failure to Darth Krayt. Instead, he stayed on Nerion. He hired bounty hunters to track down the Jedi who had interfered with his mission, hoping to eliminate the witnesses to his defeat before anyone could report back, and he continued his search for the casket, quietly hoping that persistence would eventually turn up what Force had not. Whether he ever found it is not recorded. Whether Glovoc is still out there, still breathing in the dark beneath Nerion's storms, is not confirmed one way or the other. He outlasted everyone. That is the simplest way to say it, and also the cruelest. Every Sith Lord who rose after him, Darth Bane, Darth Sidious, Darth Vader, Darth Krayt, shaped the galaxy in ways that Glovoc never could. Wars were won and lost in his name's absence. Dynasties built themselves from nothing, burned the stars, and collapsed into dust. And through all of it, the Lord of the Mind's Eye lay sealed in his casket on a forgotten planet, breathing, technically alive, and completely irrelevant. He had gone into stasis to wait for the moment the Force was showing him. He had waited 4,000 years. The galaxy never came back for him. The dark side that had pulled him to Nerion never offered a second answer. The vision that had seemed so certain, so urgent, so obviously the thing his entire career had been building toward, it led him to a planet with no way off, and then left him there. He's the longest surviving Sith in recorded history. He survived everything, and history forgot him anyway. A vision from the dark side pulled that Sith Lord to a world he never left. He was far from the first it lured to ruin. That pull has always come from one place, a single planet soaked in more dark side energy than anywhere else in the galaxy, and it is the one world the Jedi feared above all others. During the final days of the Clone Wars, the most powerful Jedi Master alive traveled alone to the ancient home world of the Dark Lords, and the planet subjected him to trials so intense they nearly broke him. It is not simply a graveyard, it is something far more deliberate. A world that stored dark-side power, manufactured authority from centuries of ritual and ruin, and consumed nearly every soul that walked its surface. What Yoda walked into had been building for longer than most people expect. Not hundreds of years, not thousands, tens of thousands. The planet goes by two names, Korriban in the shows, and Korriban in the older stories, and this video uses both. What matters is what the world did to everyone who set foot on it, and why no one in the galaxy ever managed to stop it. Drawing from both canon and legend sources, with legends carrying most of the weight, this is the full history of a world that shaped the galaxy more than most civilizations did. Chapter 1. Before the Sith.
The red dust of Korriban has been settling over the bones of the fallen for longer than most civilizations have existed. Before anyone built the first tomb, before anyone carved the first name into stone, this planet was already wrong. Barren canyon walls stripped of nearly all life, a sky the light never quite breaks through, and silence where there should be wind. The landscape does not just look empty, it looks used. To understand why Yoda's visit nearly broke him, you have to understand what was already in the ground when he landed. The Force clings to places where suffering and ritual have built up over long stretches of time. The cave on Dagobah, where Luke Skywalker confronted his own doubts, is one small example. A place where dark-side energy concentrated to an unusual degree. Most places like that are contained to a single cave or chamber. Korriban is not a single dark spot, it is the whole planet. Even the earliest legend sources, which carry most of this history, only scratch the surface of what was building here. Much of the planet's earliest history comes from those legends' accounts. Long before any civilization claimed this world, Korriban was already radiating dark-side energy strong enough to register from the far side of the galaxy. Ancient empires that existed long before the Sith recognized that power and marked the planet as significant. Those empires eventually collapsed. Korriban kept pulling, and yet, the Dark Lords did not create the corruption rooted in this world. They inherited it. The species that evolved here, a red-skinned people known simply as the Sith, were Force-sensitive from the beginning, and their culture, shaped by centuries of isolation on a world already leaning toward the shadow of the Force, was built around dark side traditions from the start. They practiced alchemy and blood sacrifice, and their burial sites were not cultural decoration, but structures built to serve a specific function. The tombs they carved were sealed chambers designed to store dark side energy, trap the essence of the departed inside the walls, and channel the life force of sacrificed servants into the stone itself. Every tomb worked like a battery, a contained system that built up dark-side power and released it slowly into the surrounding landscape over centuries. The more powerful the individual laid to rest inside, the more concentrated the energy stored within the walls, and they never stopped building them. Unlike a scar left by a single battle, the weight pressing down on Korriban does not fade at any point in its recorded history. It compounds, growing heavier with every tomb added to the landscape. Each generation inherited a world more saturated than the one before, and left it heavier still. The planet cycled through periods of habitation and abandonment, but even when its surface lay empty for centuries, the tombs kept working. The energy stored in the walls did not need living caretakers. It sustained itself, drawing from the suffering sealed inside, and releasing it slowly into the surrounding ground. By the time outside forces arrived, the species had been layering this power into the rock for millennia. The world was loaded beyond anything they fully understood. Even then, the people who would push Korriban past the breaking point had already lost a war, and they were already looking for somewhere to land. Chapter 2: The Exiled Jedi. The struggle that produced the Sith tradition did not begin in Korriban. It began inside the Jedi Order. The Legends timeline carries the fullest account of what happened next. A faction of Jedi had turned toward the dark side. Practicing forms of alchemy and force manipulation the Order had long forbidden. After a prolonged conflict later called the 100-Year Darkness, the Order defeated them. The question of what came next would define the galaxy for longer than anyone alive at the time could have imagined. The victors faced a choice that would echo through galactic history longer than almost any other single decision. They could carry out final judgment on the defeated Darksiders. They could imprison them with no end in sight, or they could exile them, sending them beyond Republic space and letting distance do what Force of Arms had not finished. The Jedi chose exile. Their philosophy demanded compassion, and a mass execution was incompatible with what the Order believed itself to stand for. The defeated faction, led by a man named Ajunta Pall, was stripped of weapons and cast into uncharted space, and what they found would reshape the galaxy for 25,000 years. They found Korriban, and what followed was not simply a conquest, but a fusion, and the thing it produced was more formidable than either side could have created alone. The Sith tradition was born from that exchange. Ajunta Pall and his followers arrived on a world inhabited by Force-sensitive people who had been practicing dark side traditions longer than the Jedi Order had existed. The exiles conquered them by force, but the deeper exchange ran in both directions. The exiles brought advanced knowledge of the Force, techniques, and depth of understanding the native species had never developed. In return, the original inhabitants offered centuries of refined burial craft, deep ritual knowledge rooted in their specific environment, and a working relationship with a planet that was itself a reservoir of dark side power. Together, on a world already saturated with that energy, they built something the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization where the Force itself was engineered into the landscape. The consequences would outlast every person involved by millennia. The Jedi Order that made exile possible would spend the rest of its existence dealing with what that mercy produced. The Valley of the Dark Lords began to take shape during this period, carved through the landscape as a deep corridor lined with tomb entrances and flanked by towering statues of the lords who rested inside. With every generation, the valley grew larger and heavier. Each new lord demanded a burial grander than the last, and the corridor stretched deeper into the canyon with every addition. What had started as a burial ground was becoming something else entirely, a seat of authority that outlasted every individual who contributed to it. Even so, the man who started it all could not escape what his creation became. Ajunta Pall, the first Dark Lord, was eventually entombed in the same stone that he had helped shape. The Legends novel Revan reveals that when visitors found his tomb millennia later, the presence waiting inside was not triumphant. It was full of regret, one of the only Dark Lords in the entire historical record to express anything resembling remorse from beyond the grave. The man who had started everything wished he could take it back. The valley did not care. It fed on the regret the same way it fed on any other suffering sealed into its walls. The tradition Pall founded would outlast him by millennia, and the valley it filled would grow into the most feared corridor in the galaxy, the same corridor Yoda would one day walk alone. Chapter 3: Valley of Lords. As the centuries passed, the Valley of the Dark Lords grew into something no other place in the galaxy could match. Red rock and sand stretched between the monuments, and the air itself felt heavier the deeper anyone walked. Each burial strengthened the next, and the combined effect of dozens of tombs radiating at once produced a surrounding weight far more powerful than any single burial could generate on its own. With every new tomb added to the system, the chamber grew louder. The air itself carried the charge. The lords did not build their tombs as memorials. They built them as instruments. They filled burial chambers with weapons, encrypted knowledge, ritual constructs, and traps designed to kill. Through ceremonies refined over generations, they seal their essences into the tomb walls, preserving their awareness long after death. The more lethal a tomb, the more famous its occupant became. The more famous the occupant, the more ambitious seekers came to attempt the challenges within. Anyone who entered the valley was tested. Anyone who tested was changed. No one walked through the valley the same person they were when they walked in. In death, the Lords of the Valley became a governing body of the departed, still conducting examinations and still passing judgments centuries after their time had ended. Among the most discussed was Tulak Horde, whose combined mastery of lightsaber combat and raw force power made his reputation one of the most enduring in the history of the Ancient Order. Accounts describing ending duels before they truly began, moving with a speed and precision that left opponents certain the outcome was already decided. His command of the Force was no less direct, draining the will from entire groups before a blade was ever drawn. He sealed the essence of his own servant inside his tomb, so the man's torment would continue as a permanent offering long after both of them were gone. Nagasato's ambitions reached far enough to spark a full-scale offensive against the Republic, and his burial chamber contained objects so volatile that trained practitioners did not enter it casually even centuries later. Still, no figure showed how the valley truly worked more clearly than Mark Aragnos. He ruled for a century, and when he fell, his presence appeared at the entrance to his tomb to judge which of his rivals deserved to succeed him. Even in death, Ragnos was still setting the terms. Two lords, Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, stood before that apparition and competed for the title. The contest was not resolved cleanly. Their rivalry tore the Empire apart and drove Sato to launch a campaign against the Republic, believing that conquest would settle the question of power Ragnos had left open. The Republic crushed that offensive and then struck back with a retaliation campaign that hit the ancient worlds from orbit, scattered populations, and targeted the temples the Order had built over generations. One fallen lord had judged two living ones. Two living ones had torn an empire apart, apparitions rising from burial chambers to confront the living, visions designed to test and manipulate, all of it still running when Yoda walked into the valley millennia later. The dead were still setting the galaxy on fire from inside their tombs. Other dark side worlds exist, but none of them work the way Korriban does. As shown in Rebels, Malachor is a shattered world, its surface littered with the remains of warriors frozen in the moment of their final stand. The power there is real and intense, but it has a fixed character sealed in place by a single devastating event. Malachor stopped developing the instant that event ended. Every other dark side world in the galaxy shares some version of the same limitation, power that is either frozen in place, tied to a single culture, or dependent on infrastructure that someone could locate and dismantle. Korriban does not stay in one place. It reaches out, draws Force-sensitive people from vast distances, and either breaks them or sends them back into the galaxy carrying its influence. It does not wait for visitors, it calls to them, and the system that built this engine had been refining itself for longer than most galactic governments had existed. Chapter 4: The Sith Machine. A young man arrived in Korriban with nothing but ability and anger. No title, no lineage, no recognized claim to anything. By the time he left, he had become the single most important figure in the history of the Ancient Order, the architect of a 1,000-year plan that ended with the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Galactic Empire. The Legends novel Path of Destruction tells his story. His name was Bane, and what happened to him is the clearest record of what Korriban's system actually does to the people who walk into it. The first layer of that process is the planet functioning as political ground. Every major dark-side regime in galactic history returned to Korriban, not out of tradition for its own sake, but because controlling the planet sent a signal with real consequences in a galaxy where the Force is physically felt. A lord who held Korriban gained direct access to a planetary well of dark-side energy that rivals could sense from an entire region away. Empires that control this world projected an authority that any regime based elsewhere simply could not match, because the authority was not symbolic alone, it was something people could feel. The second layer is the Academy, and this is where Bane's story cuts deepest. Academies operated on Korriban across multiple distinct eras, and each reflected the civilization that built it. During the Brotherhood of Darkness, the era Bane lived through and then dismantled, the Academy ran under a philosophy Bane came to regard as deeply flawed, one that rewarded cooperation and collective strength rather than individual power. What united every version of the Academy in every era was its core function. It was a filter. Path of Destruction shows students competing against each other in direct combat and being sent into ancient tombs on assignments expected to kill a significant number of them. The planet's constant dark-side pressure bore down on students without relief and without protection. Instructors did not shield them, they evaluated them. The Fallen were not a failure of the design, they were proof it was working. Bane survived, but the planet did far more than test him. His direct encounters with the tombs reshaped him from the ground up. He discovered a holocron that challenged his entire understanding of how the dark side should be practiced, and through it came to see the Brotherhood not as a legitimate order, but as a corruption of everything the Ancient Lords had built. Path of Destruction shows his time on Korriban not as training but as excavation. the planet stripping away everything in him that was not essential until what remained was harder and sharper than anything that had walked in. By the time he left, Bane was no longer just a formidable man. He carried the authority to dismantle the existing order and replace it with the rule of two. That structure would outlast him by 1,000 years and end with the fall of the Jedi themselves. But none of these parts would matter on their own, and Bane was not the exception. He was proof that the system worked. Together, they create a feedback loop that makes everything else permanent. Force-sensitive people are drawn to the planet from vast distances, some pulled by instinct, others seeking it deliberately. Once on the surface, the effects build. Creeping unease sharpens into dread. Unwanted thoughts arrive that feel less like imagination and more like memory. Visions pull from the specific fears of whoever's standing in the canyon. Those who fall on the planet add more suffering and power to the ground beneath them. Those who survive leave more deeply immersed in the dark side and carry the planet's influence back into the wider galaxy, becoming, knowingly or not, its next recruiters. The cycle has no natural endpoint. It is self-sustaining. By the time Yoda set foot on the surface, this loop had been running uninterrupted for longer than the Republic had existed. The reach of the system extended far beyond the valley itself, and the proof stretches back long before Bane's time. Frieda Nad sought out the tombs of Korriban, and as told in the Tales of the Jedi comics, found the spirit of the ancient Lord Nagasato waiting inside. He absorbed the teachings of the dark side at their source, and then carried that influence to the distant world of Onderon, where he established his own dark side legacy that persisted for centuries. Korriban did not just hold its power, it exported it. Bane walked into this engine as raw material. He walked out as the most formidable practitioner alive. And when the planet needed to make its most powerful argument against Yoda, the last Jedi who would ever enter the valley, it was Bane's image it chose to send. Korriban had been forging people like Bane for longer than recorded history could fully account for. And for all that time, the galaxy had the power to stop it. Chapter 5. Why it survived. The reason Korriban survived is more unsettling than anything sealed inside its tombs. The galaxy had the power to act. It had the knowledge. It had the motivation, and at several points in history, it tried. And yet, the system kept running. Not because the Dark Lords were unbeatable, but because every institution that tried to stop it made choices that felt reasonable in the moment, and together guaranteed nothing would ever be finished. Much of the history in this chapter comes from legend sources, where the Republic's repeated failures to deal with Korriban are most fully recorded. The earliest mistake began before Korriban even became a Sith world. The Jedi Order's decision to exile the defeated Darksiders after the 100-Year Darkness was made in genuine good faith. Exile was the compassionate middle ground between execution and indefinite imprisonment. The exiles found Korriban, they founded the Sith tradition. 25,000 years of recurrent conflict trace a direct line back to that single decision. More critically, the choice set an example the galaxy would repeat after every major defeat that followed. Survivors were allowed to scatter rather than being tracked to the end. The most devastating example of what happens when survivors are allowed to scatter is the figure known in legends as Vitiate. After the Republic crushed the Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate gathered the remaining lords on a world called Nathema. He drew life force from every one of them and from every other living thing on the planet through a ritual so complete it stripped Nathema of the Force entirely. What had been a living world became a silent, empty shell, a planet with no Force presence at all. As if the energy itself had been ripped out of the ground, Vitiate walked away effectively immortal, disappeared into the unknown regions, and spent over 1,000 years rebuilding in secret before emerging with a fully restored empire. He had trained in Korriban, he had walked the valley and stood in the tombs of the ancient lords. The conviction that power justified everything, that the end of life was a problem to be solved rather than accepted, those were the lessons the planet had been teaching since before he was born. Korriban did not simply shape him, it made him possible. When the Republic tried force instead of patience, the result was no better. The retaliation campaign after that same war was the most aggressive attempt any government ever made to end the threat for good. Sith worlds were struck from orbit, populations were scattered, and temples were deliberately targeted in what was meant as the complete destruction of an entire civilization. And yet, it failed in the one place that actually mattered. Surface structures could be destroyed, physical monuments could be shattered, but the dark side energy stored inside the tombs, the sealed essences, the weapons, the power woven into the rock over millennia, all of it survived the assault untouched. The Republic had leveled every visible sign of a threat while leaving the actual source intact. And now, no one was watching it. The campaign did not destroy the threat, it pushed it deeper underground, leaving it to grow quietly for the next civilization ambitious enough to return. Centuries after the bombardment, a small expedition returned to the Valley of the Dark Lords. They expected ruins. What they found were tombs still active, defenses untouched, the dark side still radiating from the canyon walls as if the war had never happened. The dark side energy stored in the burial chambers had not needed the surface structures to survive. It had been woven into the rock itself, and it was still building. The Republic had declared victory over a world that had not even noticed the attack. Quietly, the most damaging response of all had already been underway for centuries. The Jedi Order did not try to destroy Korriban or reclaim it. They avoided it. Rather than treating the planet as a threat requiring ongoing attention, the Order treated it as something spiritually contaminating, a place where serious study felt forbidden. The Clone Wars shows that when Yoda announced his intention to travel to Korriban, the Council's reaction was not a strategic concern. It was an alarm rooted in legend and institutional reluctance. Every time a Jedi Master warned an apprentice about the dangers of the ancient home world, anyone already drawn towards the dark side heard confirmation that the power was real. The Order's avoidance became a standing invitation, broadcast to everyone the shadow had already reached. And it meant that when Yoda finally decided to go, he went without any institutional knowledge of what he was actually walking into. No Jedi had studied the planet in generations. No protocols existed. He was walking in blind, armed with nothing except the Force and 800 years of training. Compassion that created the enemy. Force that missed the target. Avoidance that advertised the threat. 3 responses across thousands of years, and each decision made sense on its own terms. Together, they guaranteed the system would never stop. At the very end, when the Jedi Order was already in its final years without knowing it, one Jedi finally went to see for himself. Chapter 6: Yoda's Trial. Of all the beings who ever set foot on that world, only one went there not to gain power, but to prove he could survive without wanting it. In the final season of the Clone Wars, Yoda began hearing the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Master who had fallen on Naboo more than a decade earlier. Qui-Gon had achieved something the Jedi Order had believed lost for centuries, a form of awareness preserved after death, a continuing connection to the living Force. The voice guided Yoda to the priestesses, mysterious beings who existed at a boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, and who held the secret to life after death. They set Yoda on a series of trials, each one testing a different dimension of what he was and what he carried. One trial forced him to face a shadow inside himself, the parts of his own nature he had spent centuries keeping in check. His purpose through all of it was to preserve the Jedi through whatever lay ahead. The last and deepest trial required him to travel to the one place the Jedi Council had spent generations refusing to go: Korriban. He went knowing exactly what it was. From the moment he entered the atmosphere, the dark side was already pressing against him. It did not wait for him to approach the tombs or descend into the valley. On the surface, the wait was immediate. The canyon walls of the valley rose around him, lined with the same tombs that had been collecting power since before the Republic existed. Every burial chamber he passed still held the sealed essence of the Lord within, and every one of them registered his presence, the Force pressing on him, shown across that final Clone Wars arc, was not passive but directed, searching for entry points, finding the places where even the most disciplined mind carries something unresolved, and leaning on them. The planet showed him a vision of the Clone Wars resolved in a single moment, a false reality where the conflict ended, the Jedi survived, and everything he had been carrying simply stopped hurting. The temple on Coruscant was intact. The younglings were safe. The war had never reached the places it should not have been allowed to reach. It offered him the thing any exhausted leader would want the most, the lie that the struggle was already over. After 800 years of service and 3 years of watching the Order bleed out across a conflict he could not win, that vision was designed to find exactly where Yoda was most tired. He saw through it. Then the planet sent something older against him. Among the things that confronted Yoda was an apparition of Bane, the Lord whose time on Korriban had given him the authority to reshape the entire Order and establish the rule of two. Korriban selected the most potent symbol it had ever produced. Bane was the end product of everything this world had ever made. The man it had shaped and released into the galaxy to change it forever. His image was the planet's most powerful argument, a demonstration that its methods worked. Yoda recognized it for what it was and held his ground. What followed carried more weight than anything that came before it. In the final episode of that arc, Sidious himself reached through the Force to confront Yoda directly. The Dark Lord, who had spent decades orchestrating the fall of the Republic from within, now turned his full attention to the one Jedi who would come closest to sensing his presence. Working through deception and temptation, he forced a choice where every option led to the betrayal of something Yoda held sacred: save one life and condemn another. Act and cause harm, or refuse to act and allow it. And he did not come alone. Every tomb in the valley discharged at once against Yoda. The interconnected burial chambers, the sealed remnants, the dark side energy built into rock over generations of ritual and sacrifice, all of it focused on a single point. In that moment, the full weight of 25,000 years of accumulated power pressed against 800 years of conviction, and Sidious was betting it would be enough. Yoda survived by refusing the terms entirely. He did not choose between the options. He rejected the premise that those were the only choices available. In doing so, he proved the one thing Korriban had never been able to account for in its entire history: someone who could stand inside the full weight of its shadow and simply choose not to be moved by it. The planet had broken students, consumed lords, and buried civilizations. It could not break him. Not because he was stronger, but because he wanted nothing from it. And then, he left. He carried what he had learned and told no one. He proposed no follow-up action. He convened no strategic review. Whatever understanding he took from Korriban stayed inside him and went no further into the institution he led. When he returned, the Jedi Order's relationship with the planet was exactly what it had been before he arrived. There was no way to turn one person's understanding into a shared response, and the Order had spent too long not building that kind of process. No one else would learn what he had learned. Within months, the Order would fall. The Clone Wars would end not with the victory Yoda had spent 3 years trying to secure, but with the destruction of almost everything the Jedi had built across generations. The journey that had taken Yoda through the priestesses and through Korriban, the understanding of how to preserve consciousness beyond death, would prove to be among the last things of real value the Old Order produced. Korriban had been the final proving ground, and Yoda had walked out carrying a knowledge that the coming destruction could not erase. Yoda's journey to Korriban was not a turning point, it was a farewell. The deepest terror of Korriban is not the power stored in its tombs or the remnants that still inhabit them. It is the fact that the planet survived, not because of some unstoppable force, but because of ordinary choices made by well-meaning people operating under understandable limits. The Republic commanders who declared victory and went home were not fools. The Jedi who looked away were not cowards. No single person failed. The response failed, and it kept failing so quietly that no one noticed it had become permanent. just another part of how the galaxy worked. That is the story Korriban tells about the galaxy that created it. Not a story about the power of the dark side, but a story about the cost of choosing comfort over completion, generation after generation, until no single generation could undo what all the ones before it had allowed.
Every Dark Lord that Korriban ever produced was building towards a single ruler, one Sith who would finally take the entire galaxy. That was Palpatine. But the story doesn't end here. The one who made all of this possible, who shaped Palpatine into who he became, was his own master, Darth Plagueis. Watch his full story next.